Hey there, and welcome back. The day has loosened its hold on you at last. Whatever it asked of you and however far it carried you, and there is nothing left for you to do now but let it go. So settle yourself deeper into the warmth. Let the pillow take the weight of your head, and let me carry you a long way back, 300 and more years, into the candlelit courts of a small German land where one of the saddest and strangest stories in the whole history of royalty was quietly playing itself out. Tonight, I want to tell you the life of a woman almost no one remembers, and yet whose blood runs in nearly every royal house in Europe, a princess who was born to every advantage, beautiful, adored, and immensely rich, who married into the family that would one day rule Britain, and who ought by every right to have been a queen. She never was. Instead, she vanished from the world while still a young woman, shut away behind the walls of a remote castle on a lonely heath. And there she stayed, year after year after year, while the husband who had imprisoned her sailed away across the sea to take a crown, and the children who had been taken from her grew up and forgot the sound of her voice. This is a story for anyone who likes a tale of love and betrayal and long endurance, of a glittering court with a cruel heart, of a woman wronged who outlasted them all in the only way left to her. So let your breathing slow and lengthen. Let the cares of the day drift off into the dark. There is nothing here you need to hold on to, only a long and sorrowful and strangely beautiful life, to travel gently alongside as sleep comes up to meet you. And before the night is over, we will stand outside a palace on a warm July evening in the year 1694 and watch a handsome young count walk in through a side door to keep a secret appointment, and never, ever walk out again. Before the story begins in earnest, there is one small and pleasant thing I would ask of you. I am always quietly curious about who is keeping me company in the dark, so if you would care to leave a word below saying where in the world you are listening from tonight and what hour it has reached where you are, I would love to look through them later. But there is a strange comfort in picturing all these scattered rooms in all these distant places turned toward the same old story at the same late hour. And if the slow, unhurried telling of history is the kind of company you would like to keep on the nights when sleep is slow in coming, you would be most welcome to subscribe, with no urgency about it at all, so that the next of these long, quiet evenings can find its way to you when it is ready. That is the whole of the housekeeping, and I will not trouble you with it again. The rest of the night belongs to her. Picture this. A small and prosperous German town in the autumn of 1666. Its red roofs gathered close about a moated castle of pale stone and timbered gables, the river Aller sliding past its walls, the flat green country of the heath, stretching away on every side under a wide northern sky. This is Celle, the seat of a duke, a place of quiet wealth and comfortable order, far from the great capitals of Europe and content to be so. And within the castle, in a richly hung chamber, a child has just been born to the Duke and his French wife, a daughter, their only one, and the bells of the town are ringing out across the rooftops to greet her. She is wrapped and held up to the candlelight, this small new person who has arrived into such warmth and such expectation, and no one looking down at her could possibly imagine the strange and terrible arc her life will trace. From this snug and loving cradle to a locked room in a lonely castle 30 miles and a whole lifetime away. Her name is Sophia Dorothea, and she is the heiress of Celle, and tonight her whole long story lies before her, unwritten. Come back with me now to the very beginning of it, to the unusual love match that made her, and the golden childhood that was the one wholly happy chapter she would ever know. To understand the child, we must first understand the small and rather charmed world she was born into. For Celle was a happy place, and that happiness shaped her. It was the seat of one of the branches of an old and tangled German princely house, the House of Brunswick-Lüneburg, whose various dukes ruled a scatter of small territories across the flat North German plain. Her father was the Duke of Celle, George William, a genial, restless, pleasure-loving man who had spent his youth travelling and enjoying himself, who loved Italy and music and fine living, and who had come rather late and rather reluctantly to the settled business of ruling. He had made his little capital into a place of real elegance and ease, building and beautifying, keeping a cultivated court, and presiding over his comfortable domain with an easy good nature. It was a softer, warmer, more indulgent world than the stiff and ambitious courts of the greater princes, and into it Sophia Dorothea was born as the cherished only child of a doting father. There was a curious story behind her father's marriage, and it is worth telling because it cast a long shadow over her own life without her ever knowing it. As a young man, George William had been betrothed to a clever and well-connected princess named Sophia, but he was a confirmed bachelor at heart, in love with his freedom and his travels, and the prospect of marriage filled him with such dread that he did an extraordinary thing. He went to his younger brother, Ernest Augustus, and struck a bargain. The brother would take the bride George William did not want, and would have her, along with the better share of the family inheritance that went with settling down and producing heirs. And in exchange, George William solemnly swore never to marry at all, so that no legitimate son of his could ever complicate the succession or threaten his brother's line. It was a cold and a tidy arrangement, the kind of thing princely families did with the lives of their members, and it bound George William by a sworn oath to lifelong bachelorhood. The brother duly married the Princess Sophia and founded the line at Hanover, and George William went off, a free man, to enjoy his liberty. He could not have known that he had just sown the seed of his daughter's tragedy, for oaths sworn in youth have a way of meeting their match, and George William's met his in the shape of a young Frenchwoman of grace, intelligence, and great charm, a Huguenot noblewoman named Eleonore d'Olbros. She had left France, as so many Protestants did in those years of mounting persecution, and had found a place at a small German court, and there the travelling duke met her and fell, for the first and last time in his life, genuinely and lastingly in love. She was no great heiress, no princess of the blood, only a gentlewoman of modest fortune and impeccable character, but she had something the grand dynastic brides did not, which was his whole heart, and he was determined to have her. Bound by his oath never to take a wife, he took her instead in what was called a marriage of the left hand, a morganatic union, recognized as a kind of marriage, but one that carried no rank for the wife and no full rights for any children, a respectable arrangement for a prince who wished to live with a woman beneath his station. And so Eleonore came to Celle, not quite a duchess, not quite a wife, the beloved companion of the Duke, and in time the mother of his only child. But George William loved her far too much to leave her in that shadowy half-station, and far too much to let their daughter grow up clouded by the faint stain of illegitimacy, and so began a long and patient campaign stretching across years to raise Eleonore up and to have their child fully and unimpeachably legitimized. Step by step he won it. He had Eleonore acknowledged with higher and higher honours, secured her a title in her own right, and at last, after much negotiation and the spending of much goodwill and money, had his marriage to her recognized as a true and full one, and his daughter declared his lawful and legitimate heiress, a princess of the house in every legal sense. It was a triumph of love and persistence, and it transformed Sophia Dorothea from the daughter of a left-handed marriage into one of the great prizes of the German marriage market, the sole heiress to her father's rich duchy. But it had been bought at a price in resentment that would never quite be forgotten. And For the family at Hanover watched all this with cold and narrowed eyes. The brother Ernest Augustus, and above all his proud and clever wife, the Electress Sophia, that same Princess George William had handed over rather than marry, regarded the whole business with disdain. To them, Eleonore was a jumped-up Frenchwoman of no birth, a mere mistress dressed up as a duchess, and her daughter was the fruit of an unequal and faintly disreputable union, however many legal papers might say otherwise. They looked down on the girl of Celle from the height of their grander pretensions, and there was in their attitude a seed of contempt that would later bear bitter fruit. When the time came, as we shall see, for the families to be joined, the proud relations at Hanover would swallow their disdain for the sake of the heiress's fortune, but they would never quite swallow it entirely, and the girl who came among them would feel, all her married life, that she had married into a family that thought her not quite good enough. But all that lay in the future, for now she was simply the adored and only child of Celle, growing up in comfort and plenty, and it is to that sunlit childhood, the happiest years she would ever know, that we go next. The childhood of Sophia Dorothea was, by every account that comes down to us, an idyll, and it is worth lingering in it for a while, both for its own sweetness and because it makes everything that came after so much harder to bear. She grew up in the warmth of two parents who genuinely loved each other and loved her, a rare enough thing in any age and rarer still among princes, whose children were so often raised by servants and married off as livestock. But George William doted on his only child, and Eleonore, who had no other, poured into her all the affection and refinement of her cultivated French nature, and the girl flourished in that affection like a plant in a sheltered garden. She was, by every report, lovely to look at, with dark hair and fine dark eyes and a vivid animated charm, quick and graceful and full of life, and she had inherited her mother's elegance and her father's easy charm in equal measure. The court of Celle revolved around her, indulged her, delighted in her, and she grew up confident and adored and entirely unprepared for a world that would not love her. Her mother saw to it that she was beautifully educated, in the French style, for Eleonore had brought the polish of the most cultivated nation in Europe to her little German court and lavished it on her daughter. Sophia Dorothea was taught to dance and to carry herself with grace, to converse and to charm, to speak French as her own tongue, to dress with taste and move with poise, all the accomplishments of a great lady of the age. But she was taught these things in an atmosphere of love rather than of cold ambition, and she grew up not as a pawn being readied for the board, but as a cherished daughter being prepared for a happy life. That was the cruelty hidden in all that kindness, though no one could have seen it then. She was raised to expect love, to expect warmth, to expect that the world would treat her as her parents had treated her, and she was about to be handed into a world that ran on entirely different rules, where love counted for nothing, and a wife was a treaty sealed in flesh, and the soft heart her happy childhood had given her would find no shelter there at all. For as she blossomed into a beautiful young woman, she became inevitably one of the most sought-after marriage prizes in all of northern Germany, and the suitors began to gather. It was not chiefly her beauty that drew them, though that was real enough. It was her fortune. She was the sole heiress of the rich duchy of Celle, and whoever married her would one day, through her, command its wealth and its lands, and that made her a prize over which the princely houses of the region were prepared to scheme and compete. Her father, who wanted only her happiness, seems to have favoured a match that would have suited her, a marriage to a prince of a neighbouring house whom she might have grown to love, and for a time it looked as though she might be allowed something close to a happy and a fitting marriage. Negotiations were begun, hopes were raised, and the young heiress stood on the threshold of what might have been an ordinary happy match. But the very thing that made her desirable, her great inheritance, was about to deliver her into the hands of the one family least likely to make her happy, for the proud relations at Hanover had been doing their arithmetic. The Electress Sophia and her husband Ernest Augustus, who had for years looked down their noses at the Frenchwoman's daughter as beneath their dignity, now looked at her again with different eyes, and what they saw was money. They had a son and heir, George Louis, a stolid and unpromising young man, and they had a consuming ambition to gather the scattered lands and fortunes of the whole sprawling family into a single great inheritance for their line. And there, in Celle, was the missing piece, the rich duchy that would one day pass to whoever married the heiress. To marry George Louis to his cousin, Sophia Dorothea, would be to draw all of Celle's wealth into Hanover, to reunite the divided patrimony, to make their son one of the richest princes in Germany. Suddenly the low-born girl they had despised was exactly what they wanted, and so the same Electress Sophia who had sneered at the match now pressed for it with all her formidable will, swallowing her pride for the sake of the prize, and the cold machinery of dynastic marriage began to turn. The wishes of the young woman herself counted for precisely nothing in all of this. No one asked her whether she wished to marry her dull cousin. No one consulted her heart at all. The decision was made over her head by her elders, for reasons of property and power, and it was presented to her as a settled thing. There is a story, very likely true, that when she was told she was to marry George Louis, she burst into tears and cried out against it, even hurling away a miniature portrait of him in her distress, for she had no love for this heavy, awkward cousin, and no wish to leave the warmth of Celle for the cold grandeur of Hanover. But her protests, like her wishes, were swept aside. The bargain had been struck between the families, and the heiress would go where her fortune was wanted. To Hanover, then, and to the wedding would we go now. The Hanover to which Sophia Dorothea was carried as a bride was a very different place from the Celle she had left, and the difference was written into the very stones of it, and every face at its court. Where Celle had been warm and easy and content with itself, Hanover was cold and grand and consumed by ambition. Her uncle and new father-in-law, Ernest Augustus, was a hard, able, calculating man, far more formidable than her genial father, and he was driven by a single overmastering purpose, which was to raise his house as high as it could possibly go. He schemed and spent and manoeuvred to have himself made an elector, one of the small handful of princes who held the right to choose the Holy Roman Emperor, the very summit of German princely dignity, and he achieved it. He put money into making his court magnificent, with its opera and its gardens and its ceremony, and he ran his family with an iron and unsentimental hand, bending each marriage and every life to the service of the dynasty. It was a household of ambition and intrigue and chilly calculation, and the warm, indulged girl from Celle was dropped into the middle of it like a songbird into a hall of hawks. Presiding over it all, beside Ernest Augustus, was his wife, the Electress Sophia, and she is worth pausing on, for she was one of the cleverest women of her age, and one of the least likely to make a loving mother-in-law. She was learned, witty, sharp-tongued, intensely proud of her royal descent, for she was a granddaughter of a king of England, and would in time, by a remarkable turn, become the designated heiress to the British throne herself. She was everything Eleonore of Celle was not, grand where Eleonore was gentle, hard where Eleonore was soft, and she had never forgotten or forgiven the lowly origins of her new daughter-in-law's mother. To Sophia the Electress, the girl from Celle was a necessary inconvenience, a fortune wrapped in an inferior person, to be tolerated for what she brought but never truly accepted. And her son, the bridegroom, was cut from the same cold cloth as his parents, only without their brilliance. For George Louis, the man Sophia Dorothea was to spend her life with, was about as unpromising a husband as a warm-hearted girl could have been given. He was then in his early 20s, heavy of feature and heavy of manner, taciturn, stiff and dull, a young man who cared for soldiering and hunting and little else, who had no small talk and no graces and no interest in the arts of pleasing. There was nothing actively cruel in him at this stage, only a profound coldness, an incuriosity, an inability or unwillingness to give of himself. He was a man who did his duty as he saw it, and expected others to do theirs, and warmth and tenderness were simply not in his nature. To a bride raised on love, he was a wall, and he, for his part, seems to have taken no more pleasure in the match than she did, accepting it as the dynastic duty it was, and bringing to it none of the effort that might, with patience, have built something bearable between two such ill-matched people. The wedding took place in the late autumn of 1682, when Sophia Dorothea was just 16 years old, and it united the fortunes of Celle and Hanover exactly as the families had intended. For the dynasty it was a triumph, the missing piece slotted into place, the scattered inheritance gathered up, the grand design advanced, the lawyers and the elders rubbed their hands. For the girl at the centre of it, it was the closing of a door. She left the warm and loving home that was the only world she had known, and went to live among people who valued her for her money and despised her for her birth, tied for life to a husband who did not want her and could not love her, with no one to turn to and no way out. She was a child still, really, 16 and soft-hearted and used to being adored, and she had been handed into a marriage that would offer her none of the things she had been raised to expect, and from which, in that age, there was no honourable escape. The early years of the marriage were unhappy almost from the first, and grew more so. The mismatch of temperaments was total, and it bred constant friction. The lively, emotional, demonstrative young wife and the cold, silent, unyielding husband grated on each other at every point, and their quarrels became one of the open secrets of the court. She was lonely and homesick and starved of affection. He was irritated by her tears and her demands and her failure to be the quiet, dutiful, undemanding consort he wanted. The grand relations looked on with disapproval, blaming her, the outsider, for the discord, and finding in her every complaint a confirmation of their low opinion of her breeding. She had no ally in that cold house, no one to take her part, no one to love her, and the warmth she carried within her from her childhood found nothing to answer it, and slowly began to curdle into misery. And yet, in those early years, she did her duty in the one way that mattered most to the dynasty, and it is to that, to the children, that we come next. In the early years of the marriage, before everything curdled past saving, Sophia Dorothea did the great duty that was expected of every princely wife, and gave the dynasty its heirs. In the autumn of 1683, a little over a year after the wedding, she bore a son named George Augustus, a healthy boy who was the future of the line, and who would one day, in the fullness of an extraordinary destiny, become King George II of Great Britain. 4 years later, in 1687, she bore a daughter, also named Sophia Dorothea, after herself, who would grow up to marry the King of Prussia and become the mother of one of the greatest soldiers and rulers of the age, Frederick the Great. These two children were the whole achievement of the marriage, and for a time the one source of joy in their mother's increasingly joyless life, and she loved them with the warmth that found no other outlet. It is one of the cruelest strokes of her whole story that these two children, whom she cherished and who were the best of what her life had given her, would be torn from her while they were still small, and that she would never, in all her long years, be allowed to see either of them again. For even as she was bearing his children, her husband was turning away from her altogether, and he did so in the most public and humiliating fashion by taking a mistress and flaunting her at the very court where his wife had to live. The woman was Melusine von der Schulenburg, a tall, thin, plain, and unremarkable lady of the court, the very opposite of the lively and beautiful wife George Louis had been given, and yet he preferred her company without disguise and without apology, installing her as his acknowledged favourite and fathering children upon her. Sophia Dorothea was thus made to endure the standard and the bitter lot of the wronged princely wife, expected to suffer her husband's open infidelity in silence and with dignity, to share her court and her precedence with the woman who had supplanted her, and to make no complaint. It was the double standard of the age in its starkest form, for a husband might keep mistresses as he pleased, and no one would blink, while a wife was required to be beyond reproach, and George Louis, cold to his wife and warm to his mistress, felt no shame at all in the arrangement. The humiliation of it, the daily public spectacle of her own displacement, ate into Sophia Dorothea's pride and her spirit, and the marriage that had begun in coldness now descended into open estrangement and bitter, frequent, undignified quarrels. And the court in which all this played out was no neutral ground, but a nest of intrigue and malice in which the unhappy young wife had not a single true friend, and one enemy in particular who would prove her undoing. The presiding spirit of the place, beneath the elector and his clever wife, was a woman named Clara Elizabeth, the Countess von Platen, who was the mistress of Ernest Augustus, and through him a person of enormous and poisonous influence. She was clever, ambitious, vindictive, and utterly without scruple, a schemer of real talent who used her hold over the old elector to enrich herself and her family, and to manipulate the life of the court to her own ends. She had taken a dislike to Sophia Dorothea, partly out of the general contempt the Hanover faction felt for the girl from Celle, and partly, it was said, out of a more personal jealousy and spite, and she set herself to make the young wife's position as wretched as she could. She spread rumours, fostered suspicions, fed the husband's coldness and the in-laws' disdain, and worked steadily to isolate Sophia Dorothea and poison the court against her. Year by year, the web tightened. So we should pause and picture honestly the situation of this young woman as her 20s wore on. She was perhaps the loneliest person at a court of hundreds. Her husband despised her and paraded his mistress before her. Her mother-in-law tolerated her with cold disdain and took her husband's part in every quarrel. The real power behind the throne, the Countess von Platen, was her active and malicious enemy. Her own beloved parents were far away in Celle, and though they loved her still, they were bound by the very treaty that had married her off and could not simply take her back. She was surrounded, watched, isolated, unloved, and humiliated, a warm and passionate woman in her prime shut up in a gilded cage among people who wished her ill, with no affection anywhere to sustain her and no prospect of escape. It was into this desert of the heart, this aching emptiness where love should have been, that there now walked a man who offered her, for the first time since she had left her childhood home, the warmth and the tenderness and the devotion she had been starving for. His name was Philip Christoph von Konigsmarck, and his coming would be the one great happiness and the final catastrophe of her life. It is to him we go next. Philip Christoph von Konigsmarck was, in almost every particular, the opposite of the husband Sophia Dorothea had been given, and that was the whole of his danger and the whole of his appeal. He was a Swedish count of an old and distinguished and faintly notorious family, a soldier by profession who had fought across Europe and seen much of the world, and he was by every account dazzling. George Louis was heavy and silent and cold. Konigsmarck was handsome, graceful, charming, and warm, a man of dash and gallantry and quick feeling, brave to the point of recklessness, romantic, ardent, and alive. He had the gift of pleasing that her husband entirely lacked, and a fund of warmth and tenderness that answered exactly to the warmth and tenderness starving in her. He was, in short, everything she had been raised to expect in a companion and had been so cruelly denied. And when he came into her life, he found a heart wide open and aching to be loved. And there was a thread of old memory binding them, which gave their meeting the quality of fate. For they had known each other long before, as children, when Konigsmarck had spent time as a youth at the court of Celle, in the very years of Sophia Dorothea's happy girlhood. They had been young together in that warm place, had played and laughed in the same halls, and there is a charming and a poignant story that the two of them, as children, had traced their names together on a window pane with the tender old words, "Forget me not." Whether the story is literally true or not, it captures something real, that when they met again as grown people at Hanover, each carried a memory of the other from the lost golden world of childhood, and that memory gave their renewed acquaintance a depth and a sweetness from the very start. He had known her when she was happy and adored and free. She had known him before her life closed in around her, and to meet again, she so unhappy now and he so warm, was to feel the past reach forward and offer, impossibly, a second chance at the warmth she had lost. Konigsmarck came to Hanover to take service in the Elector's army, and at first there was nothing in his renewed friendship with the unhappy princess that the court could fasten upon. Her husband's own brothers liked the dashing count and brought him often to her rooms in the evenings, partly it seems out of simple kindness, to cheer up the lonely and neglected young wife with agreeable company. And cheer her he did. In his presence she came alive again, the wit and warmth and gaiety of her girlhood rekindling after the long cold years, and what began as friendship, as the pleasure of congenial company in a desert of indifference, deepened by degrees into something far more dangerous. For two people so well matched, so warm, so lonely, thrown together so often, with the one offering everything the other's life had denied her, the slide from friendship into love was almost inevitable, and across the months and the years it happened, slowly and then completely, until the neglected wife and the gallant count were, in their own hearts, and eventually in fact, lovers. We know the course of their love with a strange and almost unbearable intimacy, because, against all prudence, they wrote to each other, constantly and passionately, across the years of their attachment. Hundreds of their letters survive, more than 300 of them, written sometimes twice a week, smuggled back and forth by trusted servants, and in them we can read the whole arc of the affair in their own words, the longing and the tenderness and the fear, the snatched meetings and the agonies of separation, the recklessness of two people in love against all the rules. They are the letters of people genuinely and deeply in love, and they leave little doubt that the attachment was a true and passionate one, the great love of both their lives. For a long time afterward, there were those who claimed the letters must be forgeries, unable to believe a princess could have written so, but the judgment of history has come down firmly on the side of their authenticity. They are real, and they are among the most affecting love letters that have come down to us from that age, and they survive, scattered now between a library in Sweden and the papers of her own descendants, the imperishable record of a love that destroyed them both. But the love conducted in hundreds of letters and countless secret meetings, at a court riddled with spies and watched by malicious eyes, could not stay hidden forever, and the danger gathered around them almost from the start. As early as the first stirrings of the affair, some of the letters fell into the hands of the old Elector, Ernest Augustus, and the alarm was raised. A scandal touching the heir's wife was the last thing the proud and ambitious house wanted, and Konigsmarck was sent away to the wars to put distance between the lovers and cool the dangerous heat. But distance only inflamed them. He deserted his post on one occasion and rode for days to be near her again. The letters flew back and forth across the miles. The attachment, far from cooling, burned hotter for the obstacles thrown in its way. Warnings were given, to him and to her, by those who saw the catastrophe coming, but neither would give the other up. They were past the point where prudence could reach them, two people who had found in each other the one thing their lives had lacked and who could not let it go, whatever the cost. And the cost, as they were soon to learn, would be everything. To the gathering of that storm we turn next. By the summer of 1694, the affair was no longer any kind of secret, and the lovers, hemmed in and watched and increasingly desperate, resolved on the most dangerous course of all, which was to run away together. Sophia Dorothea had reached the end of what she could endure. She had gone that spring to her parents at Celle, throwing herself on their mercy and begging them to support her in a formal separation from the husband who despised her, pleading to be allowed to come home. But her father, for all his old love of her, would not help. He was at that moment waging a war and depended on the support of his brother at Hanover, and he could not afford to shatter the family alliance for his daughter's unhappiness. And so, to her despair, he sent her back to the marriage she dreaded. With that last door closed, with no help to be had from anyone, she turned to the only person who loved her, and she and Konigsmarck laid their reckless plans to flee together, to escape Hanover altogether, and find refuge in some friendlier court, at Wolfenbüttel perhaps, or in Saxony, where the Count held a military command. It was the gamble of two desperate people who had run out of any other hope, and it played directly into the hands of their enemies. For the plan and the affair behind it were betrayed, and the betrayer was the malicious Countess von Platen. There was, by most accounts, a sharp personal edge to her treachery. She had wanted Konigsmarck to marry her own daughter, to bind the dashing Count to her family and her interest, and he had refused her, slighting her pride, and a woman of her vindictive temper did not forgive a slight. Spurned and offended, and already the enemy of Sophia Dorothea, she found in the lover's recklessness the perfect instrument of her revenge. She gathered what she knew of the affair and the planned escape, and she carried it to George Louis and to the old elector, laying the whole scandal before them in its most damaging light. The heir's wife planning to flee the court with her lover, the dishonour of the dynasty, the insult to the family name. She knew exactly how to inflame the cold pride of the Hanover men, and she lit the fuse with deliberate care. Whatever happened next, she had set it in motion, and she would be remembered as the dark engine of the tragedy, the schemer who turned the lovers' desperation into their doom. What the betrayal set in train was swift and merciless. The decision was taken by the elector or by his son or by both that the scandal must be ended, and ended in a way that would leave no loose threads, and the means chosen was murder. A trap was prepared. Konigsmarck, it seems, was lured to the palace by a message, possibly a forged one in Sophia Dorothea's hand, summoning him to her rooms on a particular night, so that he would come unsuspecting into a place where his enemies were waiting. He was a soldier, brave and not a fool, and he may have sensed something wrong, but he was also a man in love, and the chance to see her drew him on against his better judgment into the closing jaws of the snare. The stage was set, the assassins were posted, and the warm July night was waiting. All that was needed now was for the Count to come. He came on the night of the 1st of July, in the year 1694, to the Lehne Schloss, the great palace of the electors of Hanover beside the river Lehne, and he was admitted, and he went to Sophia Dorothea's apartments, and there the two lovers met for what neither can have known would be the last time. What passed between them in that final meeting we cannot know. We know only that he was with her, and that at some point in the night he left her rooms to make his way back out through the palace, alone, along the dim galleries. And there, in a passage of the Lehne Schloss, in the dark, the men who had been posted to wait for him fell upon him. He was a strong man and a soldier, and he is said to have fought hard for his life, but he was outnumbered and ambushed and had no chance, and there in the palace he was killed. And then he simply vanished. His body was spirited away in the night and disposed of so thoroughly that it was never found, then or since. The likeliest account is that it was weighted with stones and sunk in the river Lane that ran below the palace walls, though another tale held that it was buried beneath the very floor of the palace. One of the assassins, it later emerged, was paid an almost unimaginable sum for the night's work, a fortune many times over the yearly income of the highest minister in the land, the price of a great man's death and a great secret's keeping. So complete was the disappearance that it became one of the celebrated mysteries of the age, and powerful men across Europe could not penetrate it. Konigsmarck had been a soldier of rank in the service of the powerful Elector of Saxony, who would shortly be King of Poland, and that prince sent agents and demanded answers and searched for weeks and learned nothing certain. Even the great court of France took an interest and made inquiries, and even France could not crack the secret. Hanover had closed ranks and buried the truth as deep as it had buried the body, and the official line was simply that the Count had vanished, gone, no one knew where. The mystery has never been fully solved to this day. Only a few years ago some old bones turned up beneath the floors of the palace during building work, and for a moment it was wondered whether they might be his, but the hope of certainty came to nothing. He had gone into the dark and taken the truth with him, and the only thing beyond doubt was that he was dead, and that the woman he had loved was now utterly, fatally exposed. To her reckoning we come now. For Sophia Dorothea, the horror of those days had a particular and a piteous cruelty, for she did not at first know that he was dead. She knew only that he had come to her and gone, and then that something had gone terribly wrong, that the court had turned on her, that she was watched and confined and accused. But the fate of the man she loved was kept from her, and for a time she waited, in dread and desperate hope, for some word of him, some sign that he was safe, not knowing that he was already at the bottom of the river or beneath the palace floor and would never send word again. That uncertainty, that helpless waiting for a beloved who would never come, is its own kind of torture, and she endured it while her enemies closed in around her and decided her fate. When she grasped at last that he was gone, that the warmth and the hope he had brought into her life were ended forever, she was utterly alone, disgraced, a prisoner in all but name, with no one in the world to take her part. The men of Hanover now had to decide what to do with her, and the problem was a delicate one, for they wished to be rid of her without exposing the whole sordid affair, above all without ever acknowledging the murder that lay at the heart of it. To divorce her openly for adultery would have meant proving the affair in public, dragging the killing into the light, and casting a shadow over the legitimacy of her children, the precious heirs of the line, which the dynasty would never permit. So a quieter and a cleverer course was found. The marriage was dissolved, but the official ground was not her love for Konigsmarck at all. It was, instead, her own refusal of her husband, her unwillingness to continue in the marriage, her denial of her wifely duty. By a neat and cynical legal fiction she was made the guilty party not for loving another man, but for declining to go on living with the man who had wronged and humiliated her, and the deeper scandal was sealed away. She herself, to the very end of her long life, never confessed to adultery, always denied it, and so the formal record was kept clean of the truth that everyone knew. The settlement that was pronounced upon her at the end of that terrible year, in December of 1694, was a sentence of living burial, and it was framed with a deliberate and a lasting cruelty. The marriage was declared dissolved. She was stripped of her position as the wife of the heir, denied the rank and the honours that had been hers, reduced from a princess at the centre of a court to a disgraced and discarded woman. She was forbidden ever to remarry, condemned to remain alone for the rest of her life, while her former husband was left entirely free to marry again, as he pleased, the double standard pursued to its bitter end. And she was to be removed from the world, shut away in a remote castle far from any court, kept under guard, allowed no liberty, the scandal locked up along with the woman. There was, in the careful terms of it, no thought at all for mercy or for any future happiness for her. There was only the determination of a proud family to put their embarrassment somewhere it could never trouble them again, and to keep her there until she died. But of all the cruelties heaped upon her in that settlement, the deepest and the most unnatural was the one that struck at her children. She was not merely separated from her son and her daughter, she was forbidden ever to see them again, cut off from them completely, and forever her motherhood simply cancelled by decree. George Augustus was then a boy of 11, and his little sister 7, and they were taken from their mother and kept from her, and she was never, in all the long decades of life that remained to her, permitted to look upon either of their faces or hear their voices again. The children were given out to be raised by others, by the very family that had destroyed their mother, and were taught, no doubt, to think of her as a disgrace best not spoken of. To tear a warm and loving mother from her young children, and forbid her ever to see them, not for a year or for 10 years, but for the whole remainder of her life, is a punishment of almost unimaginable harshness, and it was visited upon her without pity. Whatever she had done or not done, she had been a tender and devoted mother, and that bond, the strongest and most innocent in her life, was severed with the rest. And so, in the space of a single summer and autumn, the whole of Sophia Dorothea's life was taken from her. The man she loved was murdered and gone. Her marriage was dissolved and her honour publicly destroyed. Her rank and her place in the world were stripped away. Her children were torn from her forever. And she herself, a woman of just 28, in the very prime of her life, was carried off to a lonely castle on a wide and empty heath, to be locked away from the world for as long as she should live. She had begun life as the adored and golden heiress of Celle, with every advantage and every hope, and now, before she was 30, everything was gone, and there stretched before her only the long grey years of imprisonment. It is to that imprisonment, the strange and terrible second half of her life, that we turn now. The place chosen for her burial among the living was the castle of Ahlden, a moated manor house, standing in the flat and lonely country of the Lüneburg Heath in her father's own duchy of Celle, beside the slow waters of the river Aller. It was not a grim fortress of dungeons and chains, and we should not imagine her chained in a cell. It was, rather, a comfortable enough country house, and she was to be kept there in a kind of gilded and melancholy state, a prisoner who was also, in a strange way, still a great lady. But for all its comfort it was a prison, remote, watched, and inescapable, set down in a wide empty landscape of heath and marsh and sky, far from any court or city, far from anyone she loved, a place from which there was no leaving. The very emptiness of the country around it was part of the design. There was nowhere to go, no one to turn to, only the flat horizons and the wide grey skies and the slow river sliding past, and the long days following one another in unbroken procession. To a woman of warmth and life and society, used to courts and music and company, this exile into silence and emptiness was a refined and a terrible cruelty. The terms of her confinement were strict and were enforced with a watchful care that never relaxed across the decades. She was kept under the charge of a governor and a guard, gentlemen appointed to oversee her and to see that she never escaped and never communicated freely with the outside world. Her letters were read, her visitors were controlled and few, her movements were watched. She was permitted in time a small household of her own, ladies and servants to attend her, for she remained a person of rank and was not to be left wholly destitute of attendants, and she was allowed under guard to take the air, to drive out in a carriage along the roads of the heath for exercise, always escorted, always watched, always returning to the same walls. It was a life with the forms of dignity, but none of the substance of freedom, a great lady's establishment that was also a cage, and the contrast between the outward show of her household and the inward reality of her captivity must have been one of the bitterest things about it. Also, she was given too a strange and a hollow new dignity, for she came to be styled the Duchess of Ahlden, a title taken from the very place of her imprisonment, as though her jail were a small domain over which she reigned. There was a grim mockery in it, this title that named her prison, and yet it reflected the odd truth of her position, that she was neither a free woman nor a common prisoner, but something in between. A deposed princess kept in melancholy state, a sovereign of nothing but her own captivity. The world was not quite sure what to call her or how to think of her, this wife who was not a wife, this princess who was a prisoner, this mother forbidden her children, and the awkward title of the Duchess of Ahlden caught all of that uncertainty. Within her small allowed world she kept up the manners and the forms of a great lady to the end, dressing, it was said, with care, maintaining her household, observing the proprieties, for she had little left but her dignity, and she clung to it with a quiet and stubborn pride that no power in all those years could break. We may wonder how a warm and passionate and sociable woman of 28 endured the closing of such a life around her, the prospect of the empty years stretching ahead without limit. And the truth is that no one fully knows the inward history of those long decades, for she lived them out in silence and obscurity, far from the chroniclers of the age. But we can glimpse something of her spirit in the few things we do know. She never broke. She never confessed to the adultery she was charged with in all but name, never gave her enemies the satisfaction of an admission, but maintained her innocence and her injured dignity to the last. She never accepted that her imprisonment was just, never ceased to regard herself as a wronged woman, and she clung to the hope, year after fading year, that one day she might be released, that justice or mercy might yet reach her. She turned, as the lonely and the suffering so often do, to religion, finding in her faith some consolation and some strength to endure, and she endured, which was in itself a kind of victory, outlasting the early grief that might have destroyed a weaker spirit, and settling into the long grey patience of the captive, who has nothing left but time. For time was now the whole of her possession, and there was a terrible abundance of it. The days at Ahlden were all alike, and the years were all alike, marked only by the slow turning of the seasons across the heath, the spring floods, and the summer heat, and the long northern winters closing in, and then again the spring. She read, she prayed, she sewed, she walked in her guarded garden, and drove out along her guarded roads. She kept up her correspondence so far as she was allowed, and she waited, for nothing, for a release that never came. The court at Hanover went on with its glittering life without her, and she became a half-forgotten scandal, a name spoken in whispers, a woman shut away whom the court preferred not to think about. The children she had borne grew up far away and became in time great figures in their own right, and she was not allowed to know them. And all the while she sat at Ahlden, growing slowly older, her beauty fading, her hopes thinning, while the one person in the world who had never abandoned her fought on, year after year, to win her freedom. That person was her mother, and it is to her, and to the family Sophia Dorothea had left behind, that we go now. If there was one light that never went out across the long darkness of those years, it was the love of her mother, Eleonore, who never for a moment abandoned her disgraced and imprisoned daughter, and who fought for her with a fierce and unwearying devotion until her own death. Eleonore had given Sophia Dorothea the one happy chapter of her life, the warm French-flavoured childhood at Celle, and she did not change when the world turned against her child. If anything, her love burned the fiercer for her daughter's suffering. She used what influence she had, which was little enough against the power of Hanover, to plead her daughter's cause, to petition and appeal and beg for some softening of the harsh terms, to keep alive in whatever quarter would listen the memory that an injustice had been done. She was, in the end, largely powerless to change the verdict that the great men had pronounced, but she never stopped trying, and she never stopped loving, and the knowledge that somewhere beyond the walls of Ahlden there was one heart wholly devoted to her must have been, to Sophia Dorothea, a thread of warmth in the cold. Her father, George William, is a sadder and a more ambiguous figure in the story of those years, for he bore a heavy share of the responsibility for his daughter's fate and seems to have known it. It was he who had sworn the oath that complicated everything, he who had agreed to the marriage that destroyed her, he who had refused her plea for help in that last desperate spring, and sent her back to Hanover and her doom. Whatever guilt or grief he felt, he was bound by the same web of dynastic obligation that had caught his daughter, the alliance with his powerful brother that he dared not break, and he never freed her. He lived on for some years after her imprisonment, an aging duke in his comfortable castle at Celle, only 30 miles from where his only child sat captive on the heath, and yet the gulf of policy and pride between them was such that he could not or would not bring her home. He died in the early years of the new century, and whatever reconciliation or regret passed between father and daughter at the last, if any did, has not come down to us. With his death, the Duchy of Celle, the very inheritance that had made her so desirable a bride, passed in the end to the House of Hanover, exactly as the long scheme had intended. Her fortune was swallowed up, and she herself remained locked away, the heiress whose inheritance had been the instrument of her ruin. Eleonore outlived her husband by many years, and she carried on the lonely fight for her daughter into her own old age, never reconciling herself to the cruelty that had been done. She is said to have been allowed, at certain times and under careful conditions, to see Sophia Dorothea, for the bond between mother and daughter was the one tie the jailers could not easily justify severing entirely, and we may imagine, though we cannot witness, those rare and precious meetings, the aging mother and the imprisoned daughter in the melancholy rooms at Ahlden, clinging to the one love that had survived the wreck of everything else. When at last Eleonore died, in the early 1720s, after more than a quarter of a century of her daughter's captivity, Sophia Dorothea lost the last person in the world who had loved her without reserve and fought for her without ceasing. Her father was long dead. Her children were kept from her. Her lover was murdered and gone. And now her mother too was taken, and she was left in the final years of her imprisonment, entirely and utterly alone, with not one soul remaining who held her dear. It is worth pausing on the peculiar tragedy of her parents' position, for it is a study in how the rigid world of dynastic obligation could trap even the loving and the well-meaning. Here were a father and a mother who genuinely adored their only child, who had built her a happy childhood and lavished affection upon her, and who were yet, by the codes and the constraints of their world, unable to save her from a fate they must have looked upon with horror. The father was bound by alliance and pride, and the fear of breaking with a powerful neighbour. The mother was bound by her own lack of power and rank, the very lowliness of birth that her enemies had always thrown at her. Between them they could grieve, and plead, and love, but they could not act, could not simply ride to Ahlden and carry their daughter home, because the whole iron structure of their society forbade it. There is no villainy in their failure, only the helplessness of decent people caught in a machine larger and crueler than themselves, and it makes their part in the tragedy all the more poignant. They had handed her over, in good faith, to a marriage they thought advantageous, and they had to watch, powerless, as it destroyed her. And while the small drama of Ahlden played out, the love and the grief and the helpless devotion enacted on that lonely heath, the wider world was turning, and a strange and momentous current was carrying the very family that had ruined Sophia Dorothea toward an extraordinary destiny. For the proud relations at Hanover, her cold mother-in-law and her colder husband, were about to be lifted up by a stroke of fortune that no one could have predicted, raised from German electors to the kings and queens of a great seafaring nation across the sea. And in that elevation lay the final and the most bitter irony of Sophia Dorothea's whole story, for the throne to which they rose was, by every right of marriage, one that she should have shared. To that astonishing twist of the wheel, and to the crown that should have been hers, we turn next. The change of fortune that lifted up the House of Hanover came from far away, across the sea in England, and it had nothing to do with the merits of George Louis or his family, and everything to do with the accidents of religion and death. The throne of England, and then of Great Britain, was held in those years by a line that was failing to produce surviving heirs, and the law of that Protestant land forbade its crown to pass to the many Catholic relations who stood nearest in blood. And so the English Parliament, casting about for the nearest Protestant heir it could find, settled the succession by a sweeping act of law at the close of the century, upon none other than the old Electress Sophia of Hanover, that same proud and clever mother-in-law who had despised the girl from Celle, for she was a granddaughter of an English king and a Protestant, and after her upon her descendants. At a stroke, the cold and ambitious German house into which Sophia Dorothea had been so unhappily married found itself named heir to one of the great crowns of Europe. There is a savage irony folded into this turn of events, and it is worth letting it land fully, for it is the cruel heart of the whole story. The marriage of Sophia Dorothea to George Louis had been made against her every wish for reasons of fortune and dynasty. She had been sacrificed to the greatness of the House of Hanover, and now that house was rising higher than anyone could have dreamed, all the way to the throne of a mighty kingdom, and the man she had married was to be a king. Had she not been cast off and locked away, had the marriage endured as marriages of that kind so often did, despite coldness and infidelity and unhappiness, then Sophia Dorothea of Celle would in the natural course of things have become the Queen of Great Britain, crowned and honoured, the first lady of a powerful nation, the mother of the next king in the most public and exalted sense. The very greatness she had been married to serve would have carried her to a throne. Instead, she sat on a lonely heath in Germany, a prisoner styled the Duchess of her own jail, while the husband who had imprisoned her prepared to sail away and be crowned without her. The old Electress Sophia, as it happened, died just weeks before the English throne actually fell vacant, and so it was her son, George Louis, who inherited it, becoming, in the late summer of 1714, King George I of Great Britain and Ireland. He gathered his German court and his mistresses and his retinue, and sailed across the sea to take possession of his new and glittering kingdom, to be crowned in the ancient abbey of his new capital, to reign over a great and wealthy and powerful nation, and the woman who was in the eyes of God, and by the plain fact of their marriage before it was dissolved, his wife, the woman who should by every right have stood beside him as his queen, was left behind, shut up at Ahlden, not even told, perhaps, of the full splendour of the fortune that was passing her by. She had been judged unfit to be the wife of the heir to a German electorate, and now that electorate had become a throne, and her exclusion from it was complete. The crown of England glittered across the water, and she would never see it, never wear it, never even be acknowledged to have had any claim to it. We do not know how much of this reached her in her isolation, How clearly she understood that her husband was now a king and that she might have been a queen, but it is hard to imagine that the knowledge did not penetrate even the walls of Ahlden, and harder still to imagine what it must have been to bear it. To have been wronged and imprisoned was bitter enough. To know that the very man who had wronged her was now raised to a throne, honoured and powerful and free, while she rotted unjustly in confinement, must have added a peculiar gall to her suffering. There is no record that George I, in all his years as a king across the sea, ever softened toward her, ever considered releasing her, ever spent a moment's thought on the wife he had locked away. He simply left her there, in the German castle, a closed and finished chapter of his life, while he took up the great new business of being a British king, and she remained, year after year, the queen who never was, the uncrowned consort of a reigning monarch, forgotten in her prison while he ruled a quarter of the world away. And yet, even shut away and forgotten, she had not been left with nothing, for there was one thing she had given the royal house that it could neither return nor undo. George I might reign without her, might leave her to die in obscurity, but the heirs through whom the line would descend were hers, born of her own body, and that was a fact beyond the reach of any divorce or any prison. What it would come to mean across the generations we shall see in time. To those children, the son who became a king and the daughter who became a queen, and to the strange vindication her blood would find in them, let us turn now. Her son, George Augustus, had been a boy of 11 when his mother was torn from him, old enough to remember her, old enough to feel the loss, old enough to form his own judgment of the men who had done it, and the wound of it shaped him for the rest of his life. He grew up in the care of the very family that had destroyed her, raised by his grandparents and his father, taught no doubt to regard his mother as a disgrace, and yet he seems never to have accepted the version of events he was given, never to have stopped loving the mother who had been taken from him. There are stories, touching and probably true, that as a young man he tried to reach her, that he attempted to visit her in her confinement and was prevented, that he kept her memory and her image, and never forgave the men who kept them apart. Whatever the details, one thing is certain, that between George Augustus and his father George I there grew up a hatred as deep and as venomous as any in the long annals of that quarrelsome dynasty, and the imprisonment of his mother was one of its deepest roots. This enmity between father and son became one of the open scandals of the age, and it followed the two men across the sea to England and poisoned the politics of the reign. As Prince of Wales, George Augustus set himself up in open opposition to his royal father, gathering around him everyone out of favour at court, until the two royal households became rival camps, and the kingdom looked on at the spectacle of a king and his heir, who could barely stand to be in the same room. Much of this had its own immediate causes, the ordinary frictions of an heir impatient for power and a king jealous of it. But beneath it all lay the older and the deeper grievance, the boy's memory of the warm mother, snatched away and shut up on a distant heath by the cold father who now sat on a throne. He could not openly avenge her, could not undo what had been done, but he carried the resentment of it in his heart, and had curdled his feeling for his father into something close to loathing. The cruelest part of the son's story is that he too was kept from her to the very end, and never saw her again in all the long years of her captivity. By the time he might have had the power to free her, or even to visit her freely, he was in England, the Prince of Wales of a foreign kingdom, and his mother was dying in a German castle, and the two were never reunited. She died, as we shall come to, only a little before his father, and so the son who had loved and longed for her, who had tried as a boy to reach her and been turned away, never once in his adult life looked upon her face again. There is a story often told that after he himself became king, he sought out and displayed a portrait of the mother he had lost, honouring at last, when he had the power to do so, the memory that his father had tried to erase. And whether or not every detail of such tales is true, they capture a real and a moving thing, the lifelong devotion of a son to a mother he was not allowed to know, and his quiet vindication of her once the man who had wronged her was dead. For the deeper truth, the one that gives Sophia Dorothea's story its strange final triumph, is that her son became a king, and a far more successful and respected king than the cold father who had imprisoned his mother. George II reigned over Britain for more than 30 years, presided over an age of growing power and prosperity, led his troops in person on the battlefield, and handed the crown on in his turn to his own descendants. The cold father had tried to bury the boy's mother alive. The boy grew up to outshine him on the throne, and to reign, in the end, longer and more honourably than the man who had wronged her. That her despised and discarded self should prove the mother of so much later greatness was a vindication she did not live to see, but it was hers nonetheless, and there is a deep justice in it. And it was not only through her son that her line ascended, for her daughter too rose to a throne, and carried her mother's blood into yet another of the great royal houses of Europe. To that daughter, the little girl of 7, who had been taken from her along with her brother, and to the extraordinary destiny of that branch of Sophia Dorothea's descendants, we go next. Her daughter, the younger Sophia Dorothea, had been only 7 years old when she was taken from her mother, too young perhaps to keep more than the faintest memory of her, and she grew up to make a great match and a hard life of her own. She was married to the King of Prussia, a harsh, miserly, brutal and bad-tempered soldier king named Frederick William, a man almost as cold in his own way as her own father had been, who ran his court like a barracks and his family like a parade ground. It was not a happy marriage, and the daughter knew, in her own fashion, something of the unhappiness her mother had known, bound to a husband of iron temper in a loveless and oppressive household. And yet from that union came one of the most remarkable figures of the entire century, for the son of that marriage, Sophia Dorothea's grandson, was Frederick the Great of Prussia, the brilliant, ruthless, cultivated soldier-philosopher who would make his kingdom a major power and rank among the greatest commanders and rulers in the history of Europe. Note, so the imprisoned Duchess of Ahlden, who never in her life was allowed to see either of her children grown, who sat forgotten on a German heath while the world went on without her, was in fact the mother of a king of Great Britain and the grandmother of a king of Prussia, two of the most important monarchs of the age, and through them the ancestress of much of the royalty of Europe. The blood that her enemies had tried to shut away behind the walls of Ahlden flowed out, through her son and her daughter, into thrones and dynasties across the continent, and could not be contained or erased. There is a strange and a fitting justice in this, that the woman they had tried so hard to make disappear should prove, in the long reckoning of the generations, to be the fountainhead of kings, her despised and imprisoned person, the source from which so much later greatness sprang. They could lock up the woman, they could not lock up her posterity, and her posterity inherited the earth. It is worth dwelling for a moment on the bitter contrast between the public triumph of her descendants and the private desolation of her own life, for the two ran on side by side, unknown to each other, across those long years. While she sat in obscurity at Ahlden, her son was a Prince of Wales and then a King of Great Britain, living in palaces, courted and flattered, at the centre of the world's affairs. While she walked her guarded garden on the lonely heath, her daughter was a Queen of Prussia, and her grandson was growing up to be a conqueror whose campaigns would shake all of Europe. The most exalted destinies were unfolding in the lives of her own flesh and blood, in palaces and on battlefields across the continent, and she knew almost nothing of any of it, was allowed to share in none of it, was kept as far from the greatness of her own children as if she had been a stranger. The mother of kings denied the sight of her children, the ancestress of dynasties, dying alone and forgotten. It is one of the strangest and most poignant patterns in all the history of royalty. And here we might pause to reflect on what her story reveals about the world that made it, the world of dynastic marriage and royal power, in which a human being could be treated so. Sophia Dorothea was, in the eyes of that world, not really a person at all, but a piece of property, a means to an end, a vessel for fortune and for heirs. She was married for her money, without regard to her wishes. She was kept or discarded according to the convenience of the dynasty. She was valued for the children she could produce, and then forbidden to know them. And when she became an embarrassment, she was simply removed, filed away in a distant castle, like an inconvenient document. The warmth and the passion and the longing for love that were the truest things about her counted for nothing against the cold imperatives of property and power and family pride. Hers is the story of what that system could do to a human heart, of the human cost hidden behind the splendid facade of dynastic greatness. And it is a story worth remembering precisely because the splendor is so often remembered and the cost so rarely. But we have run ahead of ourselves, carried forward by the fortunes of her children, and we must return now to Ahlden, to the woman herself, in the long, slow twilight of her captivity, to follow her through the final years of endurance to the end. For she lived a very long time in her prison, far longer than her jailers can have expected, outlasting her parents and very nearly outlasting her husband, growing old behind those walls with a patience and an endurance that were themselves a kind of quiet defiance. To those last years, and to the strange legend that began to gather around the prisoner of Ahlden even while she still lived, we turn next. Before we follow Sophia Dorothea through the last of her long years, there is one other person whose fate was bound up with hers, and whose courage deserves to be remembered, and that is the faithful servant who suffered for her sake. Her name was Eleonore von dem Knesebeck, and she was Sophia Dorothea's lady-in-waiting and confidant, the trusted companion who had carried the secret letters back and forth, who had known of the love and the desperate plans, who had stood by her mistress through the whole dangerous business. When the storm broke and the affair was exposed, the vengeance of Hanover fell, not only on the princess and her lover, but on this loyal woman too, for she knew too much, and a person who knows too much is a danger to those who have secrets to keep. Konigsmarck was arrested along with her mistress, torn from her, and carried off to an imprisonment of her own, locked away in a separate fortress to keep her silent and to punish her loyalty. Her confinement was harsher than Sophia Dorothea's, a closer and a meaner captivity, and she was held there for years. This woman whose only crime had been faithful service to the lady she loved. The men of Hanover meant to keep her shut up indefinitely, a buried witness to a buried scandal, and there seemed no more hope of release for her than for her imprisoned mistress. But Konigsmarck had a spirit that would not be broken, and where Sophia Dorothea endured by patience, her servant won her freedom by daring. After years behind those walls, she made one of the most remarkable escapes of the age, with the help, it is said, of a sympathetic accomplice who worked secretly to free her. She got out of her prison by way of the roof, climbing out and being lowered or making her way down from a great and dangerous height, risking her neck for the liberty that had been so unjustly taken from her. It was an act of real courage, and against all the odds it succeeded. She got clean away, fled beyond the reach of her jailers, and lived to tell the truth of what she had seen. And tell it she did, for once she was free and safe in another land. Konigsmarck became a witness for her wronged mistress, testifying to the injustice that had been done, insisting on Sophia Dorothea's essential innocence of the worst that was charged against her, keeping alive an account of events very different from the official one that Hanover wished the world to believe. Her escape and her testimony were a small but real defeat for the powerful men who had tried to bury everything a crack in the wall of silence they had built, a voice raised on behalf of the silenced prisoner of Ahlden. It could not free Sophia Dorothea, could not undo the verdict or open the castle gates, but it mattered, for it meant that the other side of the story survived, that there was a record of loyalty and of injustice to set against the cold official lie, and that the wronged woman was not entirely without a defender in the world. There is something deeply moving in the loyalty of this servant, in an age and a world where loyalty so often went only upward, the weak serving the strong, and the strong discarding the weak. Konigsmarck owed Sophia Dorothea nothing but the ordinary duty of her place, and she might easily have saved herself by betraying her mistress, by telling her interrogators whatever they wished to hear, by joining the chorus of those who condemned the fallen princess. Instead, she kept faith, suffered years of imprisonment rather than betray the woman she served, and then risked her life to escape and speak the truth. In a story so full of cold calculation and betrayal, of a mother-in-law's disdain and a husband's cruelty and a countess's poisonous spite, the steadfast loyalty of this one humble woman shines out, a single point of warmth and courage in the surrounding cold. She is a reminder that even in the hardest of worlds there were those who chose faithfulness over safety, and her name deserves to be remembered alongside that of the mistress she would not abandon. And Konigsmarck was not the only one whose life was wrecked in the wreck of the great love affair, for the family of the murdered Count too was left to grieve and to search and to wonder, never knowing for certain what had become of him. Among them was a sister of extraordinary brilliance and beauty, a woman who became one of the most celebrated figures of the age in her own right, and who never ceased trying to learn the truth of her vanished brother's fate. To her, and to the wider ruin that the tragedy left in its wake, we come next. The murdered count had a sister, and she was one of the most dazzling women of the entire age, and her part in the aftermath of the tragedy gives the story an unexpected and a glittering thread. Her name was Aurora von Konigsmarck, and she was celebrated across Europe for her beauty, her wit, her learning, and her accomplishments. A poet and a musician and an actress, fluent in many tongues, the focus and the ornament of any court she graced. The great Voltaire himself, looking back, would call her the most celebrated woman of 2 centuries. When her brother Philip Christoph vanished so suddenly and so completely from Hanover, leaving no trace and no word, it was Aurora who would not let the matter rest, who refused to accept the wall of silence, who set out to discover what had become of him. She travelled to Dresden, to the court of the powerful Elector of Saxony, in whose service her brother had held his military command, and there she pressed her inquiries, seeking the truth of his disappearance and the settlement of the affairs he had left behind. She never did learn the full truth, for the secret of her brother's fate was buried too deep for even her determination to reach, sealed away behind the power of Hanover and the silence of the men who had done the deed. But her journey to Dresden in search of him changed the course of her own life in the most unexpected way, for there she caught the eye of the Elector himself, the magnificent and pleasure-loving prince known to history as Augustus the Strong, and she became his mistress. From that liaison came a son, and that son grew up to be one of the most brilliant soldiers of the 18th century, Maurice de Saxe, the great Marshal of France, a commander whose victories would ring across Europe a generation later. So the disappearance of Konigsmarck, even as it destroyed him and doomed Sophia Dorothea, set in motion through his grieving sister a chain of events that produced one of the age's most famous generals. The ripples of that warm July night at Hanover spread far and wide, into the beds of kings and onto the battlefields of the next generation, in ways no one could have foreseen. There is a curious symmetry in it, almost too neat for fiction, that the love affair which produced no acknowledged fruit of its own, which ended in murder and imprisonment and barren grief, should yet ripple outward through the families it touched to shape the royalty and the warfare of the coming age. Sophia Dorothea's own children, taken from her, rose to be a king and a queen. Her grandson became Frederick the Great, and her dead lover's nephew, born of his sister's search for him, grew into the Marshal de Saxe. The two families, joined so briefly and so disastrously by that doomed love, each sent their blood forward into the high history of Europe, into its thrones and its armies, while the two lovers themselves, who had started it all, came to nothing, the one murdered and sunk in a river, the other locked away to wither on a heath. The world took everything they had and gave them nothing, and then went on to be shaped, in part, by the very ruin it had made of them. For the Count's family, as for the Princess herself, the not knowing was its own long torment. Aurora went on to her brilliant and varied life, but she never had the certainty of her brother's death, never a body to bury, never an answer to the question of how and where and by whose hand he had died. She could only suspect and grieve and live with the open wound of the mystery. And far away at Ahlden, Sophia Dorothea bore the same uncertainty in an even crueler form, for she had loved him as no one else had, and she too was never told, never shown, never allowed the bleak comfort of knowing for certain what had become of the man she loved. The silence that Hanover had drawn over the killing was a mercy to no one but the killers. For everyone who had loved Konigsmarck, it meant a lifetime of wondering, of hoping against hope and then despairing, of mourning a man whose very death could not be confirmed. It was in its way one more cruelty among the many, the denial even of the certainty of grief. But we have followed the ripples of the tragedy outward as far as we need to, into the lives of the Count's family and the fortunes of the next generation, and it is time now to return to the still centre of it all, to the figure on the heath, and to follow her through the slow unwinding of her last years. For while kings and marshals and famous beauties played out their glittering lives across Europe, Sophia Dorothea simply endured year upon year in her quiet captivity, and the manner of that long endurance, and the strange dignity she kept through it, is itself a part of her story worth dwelling on before we come to the end, to the long grey decades of Ahlden, and to the prisoner who outlasted everything but time. We go now. The seasons at Ahlden mounted up, one upon another, into a span that few prisoners in history have matched, until the captive who had been carried there, a beauty of 28, was an aging woman of 50, and then of 60, and still the gates did not open. More than 30 years she spent in that confinement, a length of captivity so great that it is hard to take in, the better part of an entire lifetime passed within the same walls, looking out on the same flat horizons, walking the same guarded paths, watching the same seasons turn over the same heath. Whole reigns and wars and revolutions came and went in the wider world across those decades. The very map of Europe shifted. Her own family rose to thrones, and through it all she remained exactly where she had been put, growing slowly older in her quiet prison, as the world that had condemned her forgot that she was even there. To endure such a thing without breaking, without going mad, without sinking into despair, required a strength of character that her enemies had never credited her with, and it is perhaps the most impressive thing about her, this granite endurance beneath the soft and warm exterior. Tenem. Through all those years she never once admitted the guilt that had been the pretext for her ruin, and that steadfast denial was, in its way, her one weapon and her one victory. She maintained to everyone and to the end that she had been wronged, that she was innocent of the worst that was charged against her, that her imprisonment was an injustice, and she never gave her jailers the confession that would have justified them. They had the power to lock her up, to take her children, to strip her of everything, The one thing they could not do was make her agree that they were right, and she withheld that agreement with a stubborn pride that nothing could wear down. She petitioned, when she was allowed, for her release and for the righting of her wrongs. She protested her innocence to any who would listen. She refused, year after year, to play the part of the penitent sinner that would have made her captivity comfortable for her captors. It availed her little in practical terms, won her no freedom, but it preserved something more important, which was her own sense of herself as a wronged woman rather than a guilty one, and that she kept inviolate to her last breath. There is a strange and a telling detail in the economics of her imprisonment, for the Duchess of Ahlden was, on paper, a wealthy woman, and grew wealthier as the years passed. She had her own income, settled on her from the revenues of her position and her inheritance, and across 3 decades of a life with almost nothing to spend it on, shut away from the courts and the luxuries that might have consumed it, the money simply accumulated until the prisoner of Ahlden had become, by the end, the possessor of a considerable fortune. There is a grim absurdity in it. This captive lady growing rich in her cell, hoarding up wealth she could not use, a fortune locked away as surely as its owner. What became of that money in the end, who inherited the savings of those barren years, is a question that occupied the lawyers after her death. But the fact of it stands as one more strange note in a strange life. The imprisoned woman who was at once utterly powerless, and in the cold reckoning of property, rich. It tells us, too, that her confinement was never about money or want. It was about silence and pride, and the burying of an inconvenient truth, and no amount of accumulated wealth could buy her out of it. We have to imagine, as best we can, the slow inward weathering of those years, the way hope must have thinned and faded as decade followed decade, and no release came. In the early years she surely hoped, expected even, that the injustice would be recognized, that her husband might relent, that her family might prevail, that something would change. The young do not easily believe in a sentence without end. But the years passed, and nothing changed, and her father died, and still nothing changed, and her children grew up far away, and were lost to her, and still no change came, and at last her mother died too, and there was no one left to fight for her, and still nothing changed. Slowly across those decades, the hope of release must have died in her, replaced by the grey acceptance of the long-term captive, the understanding that this was simply her life now, that she would grow old and die within these walls, that there was no door in her future but the last one. To watch hope die so slowly over so many years is its own particular torture, worse perhaps than any sudden blow, and she lived it out to the full. And yet, even as the world forgot her and her own hopes faded, something was quietly growing up around the half-forgotten prisoner of Ahlden, a current of sympathy and of legend that would in the end outlast all her jailers and give her a strange immortality. For the people of the countryside, and beyond them a wider public that loved a tale of love and cruelty, did not see in her the guilty woman the official story described. They saw a wronged princess, a beauty locked away for love, a victim of cold and powerful men, and they took her to their hearts. The legend of the Lady of Ahlden began to form even while she still lived, and it is to that legend and to the place she came to hold in the imagination of those who heard her story that we turn next. There is a deep instinct in us to side with the wronged and the imprisoned against the powerful, and that instinct gathered across the years around the lonely figure at Ahlden. The official story, the one Hanover wished believed, was that she was a faithless wife justly punished, an adulteress who had brought her fate upon herself. But the official story is not always the one that takes root in the hearts of ordinary people, and it did not take root here. What they saw or chose to see was something far more affecting, a young and beautiful princess who had been married against her will to a cold and cruel husband, who had dared to love and to be loved, and who had been punished for it with a savagery out of all proportion, locked away for the rest of her life by the very man who flaunted his own mistress without shame. That was a story to stir sympathy and indignation, a story of love and injustice and a hard heart, and it spread and grew, passed from mouth to mouth, embroidered and deepened in the telling, until the Lady of Ahlden had become a figure of romance and pity in the popular imagination. The double standard at the heart of her fate was not lost on those who told her story, and it sharpened their sympathy into something like anger. For the injustice of it was glaring, and remains glaring to us now. Her husband had been openly and persistently unfaithful, keeping his mistress before her eyes and fathering children upon her, and no one had punished him or thought to. That was simply the prerogative of a prince. But when the neglected and humiliated wife, starved of affection, had turned to love of her own, she had been destroyed for it, divorced, disgraced, stripped of her children, and imprisoned for life, while the lover who shared her guilt, if guilt it was, had been murdered. The same act was a gentleman's privilege in the husband and a capital crime in the wife. The one kept his throne and his mistress. The other lost her liberty and her life and her children. It was the ancient and the bitter unfairness of a world that held women to a standard. It never dreamed of applying to men, and it was written across Sophia Dorothea's fate in the starkest possible terms, and people felt it, and it made them take her side. And so, even while she still lived, shut away and silent on her heath, she was becoming something larger than herself in the minds of those who heard of her, a symbol of the wronged woman, of love punished and innocence oppressed, of the cruelty that lay beneath the gilded surface of princely life. The prisoner of Ahlden, the uncrowned queen, the lady locked away for love, took on the shimmer of legend, and that legend was, in its way, a kind of justice that the courts and the powerful men had denied her. They had tried to erase her, to file her away and have her forgotten, to control the story and bury the truth, and instead she was passing, slowly, into the deathless realm of the romantic tale, where she would be remembered with sympathy and tenderness long after her jailers were forgotten or remembered only as her persecutors. It was not the justice she had wanted, not freedom, not her children, not the righting of her wrongs in her own lifetime, but it was something, and it was more than her enemies had ever meant her to have. It is worth saying, in fairness, that the legend was kinder to her than the strict facts perhaps allow, for the romantic tale tends to make her wholly innocent and wholly victimized, and the truth was no doubt more tangled, as truth always is. She had, by the most likely reading of the evidence, genuinely been the lover of Konigsmarck, not merely the innocent object of slander. The love letters that survive make that hard to doubt. She had plotted to flee her marriage, which by the laws and codes of her world was a real transgression, however sympathetic we may find it. She was a real and a flawed and a passionate human being, not the spotless heroine of romance, and to insist on her perfect innocence is to flatten her into something less interesting and less human than she was. But the grant that she loved and schemed and broke the rules of her cage is not to grant that she deserved what was done to her, and the legend was right about the thing that mattered most, that the punishment was a monstrous cruelty, wildly disproportionate to anything she had done, and that the men who inflicted it were guilty of a far greater wrong than any she had committed. By the time she reached her last years, then, she was already half a legend and wholly alone, the famous prisoner whom almost everyone had a notion of and almost no one had seen, the wronged lady of the heath, whose story moved strangers to pity while she herself sat forgotten by those who had the power to free her. Her mother was dead now, her last champion gone, her father was long dead. Her children were lost to her. Her lover was 30 years in his unmarked grave. There was no one left who loved her, no one fighting for her, nothing left to hope for, only the slow approach of the end. And the end, when at last it came for her, after more than 3 decades of captivity, would bring its own strange dignity, and would set in train the final and the most haunting chapter of her legend. To her last days, and to her death, we come now. It is worth pausing, before we come to her death, to ask what became of the others in the drama, the men and women who had been the architects and the beneficiaries of her ruin, for there is a kind of rough justice in some of their fates, and a kind of bleak triumph in others. The chief villain of the piece, the Countess von Platen, whose spite had betrayed the lovers and set the murder in motion, did not, by the accounts that come down to us, end her days in contentment. She is said to have been visited in her last years by a terrible decline, to have lost her sight, to have died in misery and torment, haunted, the moralizing tellers of the tale like to suggest, by the blood on her hands. Whether the details are strictly true or have been improved in the telling to satisfy our sense of justice, there is no doubt that the woman who had done so much harm passed from the scene without lasting reward, her power dying with the old elector who had been its source, her name preserved only as the schemer of the tragedy. And there were stories, too, that some of those involved in the killing of Konigsmarck, the hired men who had done the deed in the dark passage of the palace, confessed their part in it on their own deathbeds, the secret pressing on them at the last, so that the truth Hanover had tried so hard to bury seeped out in the end through the consciences of the dying. The proud mother-in-law, the Electress Sophia, who had despised the girl from Celle, and engineered the marriage that ruined her, lived to a great age, sharp and clever to the last, and came within a hair's breadth of a crown. For it was she, as we have seen, who was named heir to the throne of England, and had she lived just a few weeks longer she would have been its queen. But she died in the summer of 1714, an old woman of 84, only weeks before the English throne fell vacant, and so the crown she had been promised passed straight over her to her son. There is a certain irony in this, that the one who had been so contemptuous of Sophia Dorothea, so sure of her own superior worth and destiny, was cheated at the very last of the crown she had counted on, dying just short of the prize. She had broken the younger woman for the greatness of the house, and the greatest greatness of all, the throne itself, slipped through her own fingers in the end by a matter of weeks. As for the husband's mistress, the plain and patient Melusine von der Schulenburg, who had supplanted Sophia Dorothea in the cold heart of George Louis, she enjoyed a long and prosperous career in the shadow of the man she served. When George became king and sailed to England, she went with him, his constant companion to the end of his life, and there she was loaded with honours and titles and wealth, made a duchess, an established and powerful figure at the British court, the king's acknowledged favourite in all but name. She had given George the easy, undemanding, unthreatening companionship he wanted, asking nothing of him that he could not give, and she was rewarded for it with a long life of comfort and consequence, while the wife who had asked for love and warmth had been destroyed for wanting them. There is no neat moral in the contrast, only the bleak fact of it, that the one who demanded little prospered, and the one who needed much was broken, and that the cold king rewarded the one, and ruined the other, according to which made fewer claims upon his frozen heart. And the husband himself, George I, lived on as a king across the sea, honoured and obeyed, untroubled, so far as we can tell, by any shadow of remorse for the woman he had locked away. He reigned over Britain for 13 years, an unloved but secure monarch, dividing his time between his new kingdom and his beloved old electorate, attended by his mistresses and his German favourites, and he seems never once to have looked back toward Ahlden with anything like pity or regret. The wife he had imprisoned was, to him, a closed account, a problem solved and forgotten, and he went to his royal grave very nearly without ever having to reckon with what he had done. Of all the cruelties of the story, this may be the coldest, that the man chiefly responsible for the destruction of a human life paid, in his own lifetime, no price at all for it, but rose instead from height to height, from elector to king, while his victim withered on her heath. The world, we are forced to admit, does not always balance its accounts, and the powerful very often escape the consequences of their cruelty. But the powerful do not escape death. And here the story takes its last strange turn, for the end of George I would come hard upon the end of the wife he had wronged, and the nearness of the two would seem, to many, more than the work of chance. To her own death, and to the strange end of the man who had imprisoned her, we turn now. Sophia Dorothea died at Ahlden in the autumn of 1726, in the 60th year of her age and the 32nd of her captivity, having outlasted very nearly everyone who had wronged her, and held on to her life and her defiance until almost the end of her husband's own. She had been ill for some time, worn down at last by the long years and the accumulated grief, and she met her death, by the accounts that survive, much as she had met her life since the catastrophe, with a stubborn dignity and an unbroken insistence on the wrong that had been done to her. There is a tradition that in her final days she remained as defiant as ever, that she went to her death still protesting her innocence and still refusing to forgive those who had destroyed her, her spirit unbowed even as her body failed. And then, after 32 years within those walls, after a lifetime of imprisonment for the crime of having loved, she was gone, slipping out of her long captivity at last by the only door that had ever been opened to her, and into whatever peace death might hold for a woman who had known so little of it in life. Even in death she was not spared the spite of the man who had imprisoned her, and the manner of her burial became one final act in the long cruelty. When the news of her death reached George I, he is said to have received it without a flicker of grief or remorse, and to have forbidden any mourning for her, refusing to allow the woman who had been his wife to be honoured even by the formal observances that were due to the dead. Her body, by the bleak accounts that come down to us, was not laid to rest with any speed or any ceremony. It lay for a time uncared for, its burial delayed, while the king withheld his permission, as though he could not bear to let her go decently, even now that she was beyond all troubling him. There is something almost unhinged in this final pettiness, this refusal of so much as a dignified burial to a woman 32 years a prisoner, and it tells us, more than anything else in the story, the depth of the cold and the spite in the heart of the man she had married. At length she was buried quietly in her own old home country, at Celle, the town of her happy childhood, brought back at the last to the place where her story had begun. And there, in the church of the Dukes of Celle, the wronged heiress was finally laid to rest, near the parents who had loved her, and the home she had been taken from so long before. It would be a fittingly bleak place to end her own part in the story, with the unmourned burial of a forgotten prisoner. But the story does not quite end there, for the death of Sophia Dorothea was followed, with a swiftness that struck everyone who heard of it, by the death of the husband who had wronged her, and around that swift sequence there gathered a tale of prophecy and reckoning that has haunted their memory ever since. For George I did not long outlive the wife he had refused to mourn. Within a matter of months of her death, in the summer of the following year, he too was dead, struck down suddenly on a journey, and the closeness of the two deaths, the wronged wife and then so quickly the cruel husband, seemed to many too pointed to be mere chance, and called out for a meaning. And a meaning was duly supplied, in the form of a legend that has clung to their memory ever since. The story goes that George I had once been warned by a fortune-teller or by some prophetic word that he would not survive his wife by more than a year, that her death would be the herald of his own, and another and darker version held that the dying Sophia Dorothea herself, in her last hours, had sent her husband a letter or uttered a curse, summoning him to answer for his cruelty before the judgment seat of God within the year. Whether either has any truth in it we cannot say, and the sober historian will note that an elderly man dying within a year of an estranged wife requires no supernatural explanation. But it answered to something people wanted to believe, a sense that such cruelty ought not to go unpunished, that the wronged woman ought to have, at the very last, some shadow of a reckoning over the man who had destroyed her. And the bare facts at least fitted the story with an uncanny neatness, for he did indeed follow her into the grave within the year, as if summoned. The circumstances of his own death gave the legend further fuel, for it came upon him on the road, suddenly and far from his English kingdom, as he travelled, as he so loved to do, back toward his beloved Hanover. He was seized by some sort of stroke or fit in his carriage as it carried him across the German countryside, and he died there, in the land of his birth, hurrying home to the electorate he had always preferred to the kingdom he ruled. Some said he had been carrying a letter from his dead wife when the seizure took him, that her summons had reached him on the road and struck him down. It is almost certainly a romantic invention, but it is the kind of invention that fastens itself to a story and will not be shaken off. He was buried in Hanover, far from the wife he had imprisoned and far from the kingdom he had ruled, and the strange near simultaneity of their deaths sealed the legend that had grown around them, the wronged prisoner and the cruel king, gone within months of each other into the dark, she perhaps drawing him after her as the old tale insisted. To what survived of her after death, the letters and the legend and the long memory, we go next. What survived her, more vividly than any portrait or monument, were the letters, the hundreds of passionate pages that she and Konigsmarck had written to each other in the years of their love, and it is to those letters, more than to anything else, that we owe our intimate knowledge of her heart. They were not destroyed as one might have expected in the great burying of the scandal. Somehow they came through, scattered and hidden and preserved, and across the long years that followed, they survived in private hands, a dangerous and precious cache of evidence of a love that had cost 2 lives. In time, long after all the principals were dead, they came to light and were studied and published, and the world could read at last, in the lover's own words, the truth of the affair that Hanover had tried so hard to seal away. There had been those, for a while, who insisted the letters must be forgeries, too compromising to be real, too convenient to those who wished to believe the worst of the princess. But the patient judgment of scholars has come down, in the end, firmly on the side of their authenticity. They are real, and they are her voice, and through them the silenced prisoner of Ahlden speaks to us still, across 300 years, in the accents of a woman desperately and recklessly in love. It is a strange and a moving gift, this survival of her own words, for it rescues her from the flat condition of a mere victim, a figure to be pitied, and restores to her the full reality of a living, feeling, passionate human being. In the letters she is not a symbol or a legend, but a woman, by turns tender and frightened and ardent and despairing, longing for her lover, dreading discovery, snatching at happiness against all the odds, pouring out a heart that had been starved of love for years and had at last found someone to give it to. They are not the letters of a cold schemer or a careless wanton, the figure her enemies tried to paint. They are the letters of a lonely woman who loved too much and too dangerously, who knew the peril she was in and could not in the end choose safety over love. To read them is to understand, as no list of facts could make us understand, why she did what she did, and to feel the full weight of the tragedy, that her love, the truest and warmest thing in her starved life, should have been the very thing that destroyed her. The mystery of her lover's death, meanwhile, was never solved, and it endures to this day, one of those historical riddles that refuses to give up its secret. The body of Konigsmarck was never found, and all the searching of powerful men in his own time, and all the curiosity of historians since, has never established beyond doubt how and where he died and what was done with him. The likeliest account remains that he was cut down in the palace and sunk in the river, but it has never been proved, and the alternative tales of his body hidden beneath the palace floor and other darker possibilities have never been finally dismissed. Even in our own age the mystery has stirred, for not many years ago, when work was being done on the old palace where he vanished, human bones were discovered beneath the building, and for a moment the world wondered whether the lost count had been found at last. But the examination came to nothing certain, and the riddle closed over again. He went into the dark on that July night 3 centuries ago and took his secret with him, and it seems he means to keep it. And around the lonely castle of Ahlden, where she had passed so many years of sorrow, there grew up in time the inevitable legend of a haunting, the tale that the unhappy lady never truly left the place of her long imprisonment. A figure was said to walk there, a grey lady, the restless spirit of the wronged princess, lingering in the rooms where she had wept and waited and grown old, unable, even in death, to escape the prison that had held her so long in life. Such stories gather around every place of old sorrow, and we need not believe in the ghost to feel the truth that the old tale reaches for, which is that a suffering so prolonged and so unjust leaves its mark on a place, that the memory of it haunts the imagination if not the corridors, and that something of Sophia Dorothea does indeed linger at Ahlden, not as a literal spectre, but as a presence in the mind of anyone who knows what happened there. The grey lady of the legend is the wronged princess refusing, even now, to be forgotten, walking still through the story she was meant to vanish from. For that, in the end, is the strange afterlife she won, the woman they tried so hard to erase. They had meant her to disappear, to be filed away and forgotten, her story buried with her lover's body and her own unmourned coffin. Instead she became a legend, a haunting, a romance, her letters published, her wrongs retold, her memory tended with a sympathy that has only grown across the centuries, while her persecutors are remembered, when they are remembered at all, chiefly as the authors of her suffering. And there was a further and a greater vindication still in store for her, one written not in story or in letters, but in the blood of kings, for the descendants of the imprisoned heiress of Celle would rise to rule much of Europe, and reign, indeed, to this very day. To that final justice, the triumph of her blood, we turn next. The final vindication, the one that outweighs all the romance and all the sympathy, lies in a simple and an astonishing fact, which is that the woman the House of Hanover cast off and tried to erase became, in the long reckoning of the generations, the ancestress of its entire future, and reigns, through her descendants, to this very day. Consider what her enemies achieved and what they did not. They could take her freedom, her children, her honour, her place in the world. They could lock her away and forbid her name. They could leave her unmourned and bury her in obscurity. But the one thing they could not do, having married her for exactly this purpose, was undo the fact that she was the mother of the line. Every drop of royal blood that flowed forward from George I flowed through her as much as through him, for the heirs were hers, and there was no other channel. In casting her off they had already, irrevocably, taken what they needed from her, and it bound her into the dynasty forever, whether they acknowledged her or not. And so it has come to pass that the disgraced and imprisoned Duchess of Ahlden, the Queen who never was, is the direct ancestress of every British sovereign who has reigned across the 3 centuries since her death, down to the present day. The crown she was never allowed to wear has passed, generation after generation, through her own descendants. The family that locked her away has handed her blood down its whole length, unable to do otherwise. Through her daughter, the same blood runs through the royal line of Prussia and into the wider royalty of Germany and beyond. There is scarcely a throne in Europe, in the centuries that followed, that her descendants did not touch. The woman they meant to make vanish proved, in the end, impossible to erase, woven by the very marriage that destroyed her into the foundations of half the crowned heads of the continent, the hidden source of a river of kings. There is a deep and a satisfying justice in this, the only justice her story affords, and it is worth savouring precisely because the rest of the tale is so unjust. The powerful men who broke her went, most of them, unpunished in their own lifetimes. Her husband rose to a throne and died untroubled. The world did not balance its accounts where she could see it. But time keeps a longer ledger than any single life, and time has given the verdict to her. The cold husband and the proud mother-in-law and the scheming countess are remembered now when they are remembered at all, only as the persecutors in the tragedy of Sophia Dorothea, while she herself is remembered with tenderness and pity, her letters cherished, her wrongs mourned, and her blood enthroned across Europe. They tried to write her out of the story. Instead, they wrote her into its very heart, and there she remains, the mother of the line that disowned her, the ancestress of the kings who came after the men who locked her away. It is not the justice she wanted, which was freedom, and her children, and the righting of her wrongs in her own lifetime, but it is justice of a kind, the long, slow justice of history, and it is hers. To understand the full weight of her tragedy, though, we must lift our eyes from her particular fate and look at the order that made it possible, for she was not destroyed by uniquely wicked people so much as by an ordinary and accepted system, and that is in some ways the most disturbing truth of all. The men and women who ruined her were not monsters of a special kind. They were princes and princesses behaving according to the settled rules and assumptions of their world, and those rules, not their individual cruelty, were the deepest cause of her suffering. In that world, a royal woman was not a free person with a life of her own to live. She was a dynastic asset, a means of joining lands and fortunes and bloodlines, and her marriage was a transaction conducted over her head for the benefit of the family. Her wishes were irrelevant. Her happiness was nobody's concern. Her body existed to produce heirs and her person to seal alliances. This was simply how things were done, accepted by everyone, including, very often, the women themselves, who were raised to expect nothing else. Within that system, the double standard that destroyed Sophia Dorothea was not an aberration but a rule, woven into the whole fabric of aristocratic life. A husband's infidelity was expected and excused, a mere matter of course, attracting no penalty and no shame. A wife's was a catastrophe, a stain upon the bloodline, a threat to the certainty of the succession, and it was punished with a severity that reflected how much was thought to be at stake. For the great fear, in a world where inheritance flowed through legitimate birth, was that a wife's adultery might smuggle a bastard into the line of succession, might corrupt the precious purity of the descent, and so a wife's fidelity was guarded and demanded with an iron and a merciless rigour, while a husband, who could father no illegitimate heir upon his own wife, was free to stray as he pleased. It was unjust, grotesquely so, but it was not personal. It was the cold logic of a system built on blood and property, and Sophia Dorothea was crushed not by the malice of individuals alone, but by the whole weight of that system bearing down on a single warm and erring human heart. To what her story means to us now, looking back across the centuries, we turn at last. It is worth pausing here to picture more fully the society she actually lived in, the physical and human texture of those German courts, for it was a world very different from our own, and very different even from the great capitals of its own age, and knowing it helps us feel her story from the inside. The Germany of her lifetime was not one country but a patchwork of hundreds of separate states, dukedoms and electorates and principalities and free cities, each with its own ruler and its own little court, scattered across the heart of the continent like so many pieces of a shattered mirror. Celle and Hanover were two such pieces, small German states ruled by branches of the same family, and the life of their courts was a curious mixture of real grandeur and provincial smallness, of princes who aped the magnificence of the great powers on a modest scale, building their opera houses and laying out their gardens and keeping their ceremony, while ruling territories a fraction the size of the kingdoms they admired. Into such a world Sophia Dorothea was born, and within it her whole life was lived, from the comfortable wealth of Celle, to the chillier grandeur of Hanover, to the remote isolation of Ahlden. The rhythms of life in such a place were slow and seasonal, in a way we can scarcely imagine now, governed by the turning of the year and the hours of daylight, by the long journeys that connected one court to another over bad roads in jolting carriages, by the great set pieces of the court calendar, the hunts and the feasts and the formal receptions. A princess of that world lived her life almost entirely in public, surrounded always by attendants, her every action observed and reported. Privacy a thing almost unknown, she dressed and undressed before her ladies, dined before the court, was never, in the ordinary way, alone. The court was at once her whole universe and her perpetual audience, a place of intense observation where nothing went unnoticed, and everything was material for gossip and intrigue, and where a woman with enemies, as Sophia Dorothea had, could find no corner to hide in and no act unwatched. When we remember that her love affair had to be conducted in such a place, under such constant observation, smuggled through trusted servants and snatched in stolen moments, we understand better both its recklessness and its desperation, the enormous risk of every meeting, the near impossibility of keeping any secret in that hall of watching eyes. And the heath to which she was finally banished was, in its own way, as characteristic of her world as the courts, for the Lüneburg Heath was a vast, flat, sparsely peopled country of sandy soil and rough grazing, of heather and marsh and slow rivers, a poor and lonely land far from the centres of life. To be sent there was to be sent not merely to a particular castle, but into a kind of emptiness, a landscape that swallowed sound and figures alike, where the horizons were wide and low, and the sky was everything, and the nearest court was a long day's journey away. The very geography enforced her isolation. There was nowhere within reach to flee to, no neighbouring society to slip into, only the heath, stretching away on every side, beautiful perhaps in its bleak way under the great northern skies, but a beauty that was also a wall. She had been raised in the snug warmth of a comfortable court, and the chill formality of a grand one, and she ended in this wide emptiness, and the contrast was itself part of her punishment, the sociable woman set down in a solitude as wide as the sky. But for all that we can reconstruct of her world, the woman herself remains in some ways elusive, glimpsed rather than known, and it is worth gathering what we can of her actual character, the person behind the legend and the victim. From everything that survives, the picture that emerges is of a warm, lively, emotional, and rather impulsive nature, a woman of strong feelings and quick temper, affectionate and demonstrative, hungry for love, and easily wounded by its absence. She was not, by the evidence, a cold or a calculating person. Her tragedy flowed precisely from the opposite quality, from a heart too warm and too needful for the chilly world it was thrown into, a heart that could not be content with the loveless dignity that was all her marriage offered. She had courage too, the courage of her long unbroken denial and her stubborn endurance, and she had pride, the fierce pride that would not confess and would not bend. And she had, in her youth at least, charm and gaiety and beauty in abundance. She was, in short, a vivid and a passionate human being, and it was her misfortune to be a vivid and passionate human being in a position that called for a cold and a compliant one, her great flaw, if we are to call it that, was the same as her great virtue, an inability to settle for less than love, a refusal of the loveless bargain that her world expected her to accept. A more prudent, a more cynical, a colder woman would have done as so many royal wives did, accepting the unfaithful husband and the loveless marriage with outward calm, taking her consolations discreetly, if at all, never risking everything on a forbidden passion. Sophia Dorothea could not do this. She wanted to be loved openly and wholly, as she had been loved in her childhood, and when love came to her in the person of Konigsmarck, she could not turn it away, even knowing the danger, even with everything to lose. There is a kind of greatness in that, in the refusal to live without love, as well as the seeds of her destruction, and it is what makes her, across the centuries, so sympathetic and so human a figure, not a plaster saint, nor a wicked adulteress, but a warm woman who loved too much in a world that had no place for warmth. To the broader scandal her love became, and the stir it made across the continent, we come next. The disappearance of a count and the imprisonment of a princess could not be kept a local affair, however much Hanover wished it, for the courts of Europe were bound together by a web of marriage and correspondence and diplomacy, and a scandal of this magnitude ran along those threads to every capital on the continent. Konigsmarck had been a man of rank and reputation, known in many courts, a soldier in the service of a great prince, and his sudden vanishing could not pass unnoticed. Questions were asked, in Dresden and in Vienna and in Paris and beyond, and though no certain answers came, the very silence of Hanover spoke loudly enough. Everyone of any consequence on the continent soon had some notion of what had happened, that the heir of Hanover's wife had taken the dashing count for her lover, that the affair had been discovered, that the count had been made to disappear and the princess shut away. It was exactly the kind of story that the gossiping intermarried aristocracy of the age relished, a tale of love and violence and royal scandal, and it was told and retold in 100 drawing-rooms and 100 letters, carrying the name of Sophia Dorothea and the shame of Hanover across the whole of Europe. For the proud house that had tried to bury the matter, this wide notoriety was itself a kind of punishment, a stain upon the dynastic honour they had been so anxious to protect. They had killed and imprisoned precisely to avoid scandal, to keep the family name clean, and instead they had created one of the great scandals of the age, a story that would cling to them forever, that would be told whenever their name was spoken. The very ruthlessness of their solution made it more memorable, not less. A quietly tolerated affair would have been forgotten in a season, but a murdered lover and a princess imprisoned for 30 years was a tale for the ages, and it fixed itself to the House of Hanover as an indelible mark. When that house rose, not long after, to the throne of Britain, the scandal travelled with it, and the new British subjects of King George I soon learned that their imported German monarch had a wife they never saw, locked away in a castle across the sea, and they drew their own conclusions about the kind of man they had been given for a king. The cold and unloved George I was never popular in his new kingdom, and the strange dark story of his imprisoned wife did nothing to warm his subjects toward him. There is an irony worth noting in the fact that the affair Hanover tried so hard to suppress is now, for many people, the single most interesting thing about that early Hanoverian house, that the human story that draws us into an otherwise rather grey and unlovable set of German princes. The first two Georges of Britain are not, in the ordinary way, figures to capture the imagination. They were stolid, German-speaking, unromantic men, more interested in their electorate and their mistresses than in their new kingdom, and history has not loved them. But the story of Sophia Dorothea throws a shaft of real drama and real feeling across that dull dynastic landscape, a tale of passion and cruelty and tragic endurance that humanizes the whole period and gives it a heart. The princess they imprisoned has become, in a sense, the most vivid and the most remembered of them all, the one whose story still moves us, while the kings who wronged her are remembered chiefly as the background to her tragedy. It is one more turn of the long justice that has been done her, that the scandal meant to be buried has become her monument. If we stand back now and survey the whole shape of her life, we are struck by a terrible and an almost too perfect symmetry, for it falls into two halves of nearly equal length, divided by that one catastrophic summer, and the two halves could hardly be more opposite. She lived 60 years. For the first 28 of them she was free, and for the last 32 she was a prisoner, so that very slightly more than half her life was spent in captivity, a whole long lifetime of imprisonment balanced against a slightly shorter span of liberty. The hinge between the two was the summer of the murder, the few terrible weeks in which everything she had was taken from her at a stroke, and on either side of that hinge lie the two utterly different lives she lived, the free woman and the captive, the princess and the prisoner, the same person, and yet, across that divide, almost two separate beings, and the contents of the two halves mirror each other with a cruel exactness. The first half held everything, or seemed to, a loving home, beauty, wealth, rank, marriage, motherhood, and at the last a great and passionate love. The second half held nothing, or nearly nothing. Solitude, confinement, the loss of her children and her honour and her freedom, the slow fading of hope, and at the last a lonely death. She had been given in the first half every gift the world could offer. She had it all taken away, in the second, with a thoroughness that left her almost bare. To live such a life, to have known such fullness and then such emptiness, to remember in the long grey years of Ahlden the warmth and the love and the freedom of the years before, must have been a particular refinement of suffering, for she had not been born to deprivation and grown used to it. She had been born to abundance and had it stripped from her in her prime, and she had to live out more than half her life in the memory of what she had lost. The symmetry of it is the symmetry of a tragedy. The rise and the fall give an equal weight, and it gives her story a shape as stark and as complete as any in history. To the places that held her, and the memory that holds her still, we go now. The three places that framed her life still stand after their fashion, and something of her clings to each of them, so that her story is written into the geography of that quiet corner of Germany, as well as into the books. There is Celle, first of all, the town of her birth, and her happy childhood, with its moated castle of pale stone and its close-gathered streets, the warm cradle of her early years. It was here she was born, here she was loved, here she ran as a cherished child through halls that must have seemed to her the whole bright world. And it was to Celle, by a fitting circle, that she was brought back at the very end, for her body, denied honour by her husband, was laid to rest at last in the town of her beginnings, in the church where the Dukes of Celle lay, returned in death to the one spot on earth that had only ever been kind to her. There she rests still, the wronged princess home at last, and those who go there may stand by the grave of the queen who never was, and remember the strange long arc that carried her from that town and back to it across 60 years of glory and ruin. There is Hanover, the second of her three, the chillier and grander court where her marriage was made and her tragedy set in motion, where she bore her children and endured her husband's coldness, and met and loved the Count who would be her undoing. The palace where Konigsmarck vanished, the Lenischloss beside its river, stood for centuries as the silent witness to that July night, the dim galleries where a man was struck down and carried away into the dark. And though the building has known many changes and many uses across the long years since, the river still runs beside it, the same slow water that very likely closed over the body of the murdered Count and kept his secret all this time. To stand there is to stand at the very hinge of her life, the point where the first half ended and the second began, where love met murder in a darkened corridor, and a whole future was destroyed in a single night. The stones keep their counsel, as stones do, but the story is in them for anyone who knows it, and there is Ahlden, last of the three, the lonely castle on the wide heath where she passed the long second half of her life, and where she died, the house whose very name became her title and her prison. It stands yet, out in that flat and quiet country, a moated manor house among the heather and the slow rivers, and of the three it is the one most wholly hers. For the others she shared with many, but Ahlden was hers alone, her kingdom and her cell, the stage of her 32-year endurance. The grey lady of the legend walks there still, they say, and whether or not one believes in such things, it is true that of all the places touched by her story, Ahlden is the one most haunted by her, most heavy with the memory of a human being shut away from the world for the better part of a lifetime. The three places together trace the whole map of her life, the warm cradle, the cold court, the lonely prison, and they stand there yet in that German landscape, the geography of a tragedy that the centuries have not erased. And the story itself, beyond the places, has had a long and a vivid afterlife, told and retold across the generations by all those who could not let so affecting a tale rest. From soon after her own time, her story passed into the keeping of the storytellers and the poets and the romancers, who found in it everything a great tragic tale requires, beauty and love and cruelty and injustice and long-suffering, and who made of the wronged Princess of Ahlden a figure of romance that has never since lost its power to move. The bare facts of her life, dramatic enough in themselves, are taken up by the romantic imagination and shaped into a tale of doomed lovers and tyrannical power, of innocence oppressed and love punished, that struck a deep chord in everyone who heard it. Her letters, once they came to light, gave the story a core of authentic feeling that no invention could match, the real voice of the real woman speaking out of the real tragedy. And around that core the tellers wove their tellings, until Sophia Dorothea took her place among the great tragic heroines of history, remembered and mourned by people who never knew her, in ages she could not have imagined. There is something fitting and something just in this long afterlife of her story, this refusal of the generations to let her be forgotten. For her enemies had wanted, above all, that she should be forgotten, that the scandal and the woman alike should be buried and erased, that her name should pass out of memory and her story be lost. And the exact opposite has happened. Her name is remembered when theirs are forgotten. Her story is told and retold while their reigns gather dust. She lives, in the imagination of the centuries, more vividly than the kings who locked her away. The act of telling her story, the simple refusal to let her vanish, is itself a kind of justice, a standing rebuke to the men who tried to erase her, and every fresh telling renews it, to gather, at the last, what her story might mean to us who hear it now. Across so great a distance of years, we come at last. What are we to take from such a life, we who hear it now across 3 centuries, in a world so different from hers that she would scarcely recognize it? There is, first, the simple and the sobering reminder of how recently, in the long span of history, human beings of even the highest rank could be treated as mere instruments, Their lives and loves and happiness counted as nothing against the cold demands of family and property and power. We are inclined to envy the great ones of the past, their palaces and their jewels and their precedents, and to forget that the gilded life could be a gilded cage, that a princess might be as powerless over her own fate as the lowliest of her servants, that rank brought its own particular forms of bondage. Sophia Dorothea had everything the world counts as fortune, birth and beauty and wealth and position, and not one of these things could save her, or buy her an hour of freedom, or shield her from a fate that the poorest free woman might have escaped. There is a lesson in that about the difference between fortune and happiness, between the appearance of a blessed life and its inward reality, that is worth carrying away from her story. But the deeper thing her life offers us, I think, is a meditation on endurance, on what it is to survive the unsurvivable, to go on living when all that made life worth living has been taken away. This is, above all, a story of endurance, of a woman who lost everything and yet did not die of it, did not go mad, did not break, but lived on year after year after year, holding to her own truth and her own dignity in the face of a fate designed to crush them. There is a quiet heroism in that which is easy to overlook, because it is so undramatic, so without action or incident. It is the heroism of simply continuing, of refusing to be destroyed inwardly, even when one has been destroyed outwardly, of keeping some core of oneself inviolate, when all else has been stripped away. Sophia Dorothea could not escape her prison, could not recover her children, could not undo her ruin. The one thing left to her was to endure it without surrendering her sense of who she was and what had been done to her, and that she did for 32 years, and it was a victory of a kind, the only victory left to her. There is, too, in her long refusal to confess a guilt she did not fully own, a profound assertion of the one freedom that cannot finally be taken from a person, the freedom of the inner self, the freedom to hold one's own judgment of one's own life against all the might in the world. They could compel her body, confine it, move it, watch it. They could not compel her mind to agree with them. To the end, she judged her own case by her own lights, maintained her own version of the truth, refused the false confession that would have eased her captivity at the cost of her integrity. In a life almost wholly powerless, this was the one freedom she kept, and she kept it to the grave, and there is something magnificent in it, this unbreakable inner freedom of a woman who had lost every outer freedom there was. It suggests that there is, even in the most absolute captivity, some final inward citadel that no power can storm unless its owner chooses to surrender it, and that she never did. And beneath the royal trappings, beneath the German courts, and the dynastic schemes and the long-ago quality of it all, hers is a story of the most universal and the most human things, of love and loss and time, and that is why it still reaches us. Strip away the princess and the count and the castles, and what remains is a woman who longed to be loved, who found love and lost it terribly, who was punished beyond all reason for the crime of having a heart, and who had then to live out a long life in the shadow of that loss. There is nothing in that which is foreign to us, nothing that belongs only to the 17th century or only to royalty. The longing for love, the agony of its loss, the struggle to endure what cannot be changed, these are the common inheritance of every mortal life, and we recognize them in her, across all the distance of years and rank. She speaks to us not as a princess, but as a fellow creature who suffered the things that human beings suffer, more cruelly than most, and bore them with more courage than most. And that is the ground of the strange intimacy we feel with her, the sense that her sorrow is somehow our own. Perhaps the truest thing to say is that her life stands as a kind of monument to the cost of a world that valued power over persons, that the splendour of those old dynasties, the marriages and the alliances and the gathering of crowns, was built upon the sacrifice of human beings like her, real people with real hearts, fed into the machine of greatness and crushed by it. We tend to remember the greatness, the kings and the conquests and the glittering courts, and to forget the cost, and her story is a way of remembering the cost, of putting a face and a voice to the price that was paid, behind the scenes and out of sight, for all that royal magnificence. She is the queen who never was, and in being so she tells us more about what those crowns really cost than any of the queens who actually wore them. To hold her in memory is to keep faith with all the unremembered others who were sacrificed as she was, and it is a thing worth doing, a small justice we can still offer her, 300 years too late, and yet not, perhaps, entirely in vain. But before we let her rest, there are a few faces in her story we have passed too quickly, and a few corners of her world we have not yet entered, and it is worth lingering over them a little while longer in the quiet of the night. Let us turn first to the man whose love undid her, and look more closely at who he really was. Philip Christoph von Konigsmarck, the man whose love for Sophia Dorothea cost them both so dearly, deserves to be seen in his own right, and not merely as the romantic shadow at the edge of her tragedy, for he came of one of the most remarkable families of the age, and lived in his short life a career as dramatic as any in it. The Konigsmarcks were a Swedish noble house of the first rank, soldiers and adventurers who had risen to fame and fortune in the great wars that had torn Europe apart in the previous generation, and the name carried a glamour and a notoriety in equal measure. Konigsmarck men had commanded armies and stormed cities. An elder of the house had risen to be a field marshal in the long German wars of the previous age, and the name had been carried at the head of regiments and murmured in the courts of half a dozen nations. The family had produced renowned warriors and renowned beauties and renowned scandals in roughly equal measure, and a kind of wild, brilliant, doom-touched quality seemed to cling to them all as though greatness and ruin came to them braided together. Philip Christoph was a worthy son of that house, brave, dashing, handsome, and reckless, a professional soldier who had fought across Europe and seen much of the world before ever he came to twine his fate with the unhappy princess of Hanover. He had been, in a sense, a citizen of all Europe, as men of his class and profession often were, moving from court to court and from army to army, selling his sword and his courage to whichever prince had need of them, at home everywhere and nowhere. He had served in various campaigns, won a reputation for valour, mixed in the highest circles of half a dozen lands, and acquired the polish and the address that made him so dangerous a contrast to the wooden George Louis. There was about him, by every account, an irresistible charm, the charm of the brave and the careless and the gay, the man who lives intensely and laughs at danger, and it was this, as much as his looks, that won hearts wherever he went. He was no mere fortune-hunting seducer, though. The letters show a man as deeply and as genuinely in love as the woman he wrote to, as reckless with his own safety as with hers, willing in the end to risk and to lose everything for her. Whatever his faults, and a careless gallant of that stamp surely had them, he loved Sophia Dorothea truly, and he died for it. His recklessness, indeed, was very likely the proximate cause of the catastrophe, for a cooler and a more cautious man might have read the danger and drawn back in time. He had been warned more than once that the affair was known and that his life might be at risk. He had been sent away, exiled, given every chance to break it off and save himself, and each time he had come back, drawn by his love and his daring, into ever greater peril, until at last he walked into the trap that killed him. There is a terrible irony in the very courage that was his finest quality becoming the instrument of his destruction, in the brave man, undone by his own bravery, unable to do the prudent and cowardly thing that would have saved his life. He went to the Lenneschloss that last night, it seems, against his own better judgment, knowing or half-knowing the risk, because the chance to see her was worth more to him than his safety. And so the soldier who had survived the wars of Europe was struck down at last, not on a battlefield, but in a darkened palace corridor, the victim of a love he would not give up. It is worth remembering, too, that his death was not only a private tragedy, but a political act, a calculated killing carried out to serve the interests of a dynasty, and that the men who ordered it did so with a cold deliberation that is in some ways more chilling than any crime of passion. This was no hot-blooded murder in a moment of rage. It was a considered decision, taken at the highest level, that a man's life was an acceptable price for the protection of the family's honour and the security of its succession. The enormous sum paid to the chief assassin tells its own story of a deed planned and purchased and carried out as a matter of policy, the removal of an inconvenient obstacle by the most efficient available means. In the cold arithmetic of the dynasty, Konigsmarck was a problem, and murder was the solution, and the solution was applied without apparent qualm. That a charming, brave, living man, loved by a princess and by his brilliant sister, and by all who knew him, could be coldly decided away in this fashion, snuffed out and sunk in a river to keep a family's name clean, is perhaps the starkest illustration in the whole story of what that world was capable of when its interests were threatened. And so he vanished from the world at 29, this brilliant and reckless and ill-fated man, leaving behind him a grieving sister who would search for him in vain, a princess who would mourn him for 32 years, and a mystery that has never been solved. He had blazed briefly and brightly across the courts of Europe, a true son of his wild and famous house, and he had thrown it all away, life and career and future, for the love of a woman he could not have. And there is in his fate, as in hers, a quality of tragic waste that haunts the imagination, the sense of bright and living things needlessly destroyed. The two of them, the princess and the count, were in some ways well matched even in this, that both were warm and passionate and alive in a world that had no mercy for such qualities, and both were broken by it, the one quickly and the other slowly, but both as surely. We have looked now at the man. Let us turn next to the woman who was his opposite in every way, the formidable mother-in-law whose long life throws Sophia Dorothea's ruin into such sharp relief. The Electra Sophia, the mother-in-law who had despised Sophia Dorothea and helped engineer her unhappy marriage, deserves a closer look of her own, for she is the great foil to her ruined daughter-in-law, the woman who played the same cruel game, and won where the other lost, and the contrast between the two illuminates them both. She was one of the most intelligent and accomplished women of her century, a granddaughter of a king, a friend and correspondent of some of the finest minds of the age, learned in languages and philosophy, shrewd, witty, and tough as old leather. She had been handed about in the marriage market herself in her youth, had swallowed her own disappointments, had married a man she did not choose and made the best of it, and had spent a long life advancing the interests of her house with unwearying skill and patience. Where Sophia Dorothea was warm, impulsive, and ruled by her heart, the old electress was cool, calculating, and ruled by her head, and the difference in their temperaments was the difference in that hard age between survival and destruction. For the Electra Sophia had learned, as her daughter-in-law never could, the essential lesson of the royal woman's life, which was to master her own heart, to subordinate every personal feeling to the cold demands of the dynasty, and to find her satisfactions in power and intellect, and the advancement of her line rather than in love. She did not rebel against the rules of her world. She studied them, mastered them, and turned them to her advantage, and they carried her, in the end, to the very threshold of a throne. She accepted the loveless bargains, endured the indignities, suppressed whatever longings she may have had, and played the long game of dynastic ambition with consummate skill, and her reward was to be named heir to one of the great crowns of Europe, and to become the ancestress of a royal line. She was, by the standards of her time, a triumphant success, precisely because she had made herself into the kind of woman that age rewarded, hard, patient, self-controlled and ambitious, with her heart kept firmly under the governance of her interest. And there, in that contrast, lies one of the deepest lessons of Sophia Dorothea's tragedy, for it shows us that her destruction was not simply a matter of bad luck or individual villainy, but flowed from a kind of temperamental unfitness for the life she had been born to. The world she lived in had a place for women, even a kind of greatness for them, but only on its own harsh terms, only for those who could make themselves cold enough, and hard enough, and patient enough to play its game, and Sophia Dorothea could not. She was too warm, too honest, too much in need of love, too little able to suppress her own heart, and in a world that demanded the suppression of the heart above all things, that warmth was a fatal flaw. The very qualities that make her so sympathetic to us, her capacity for love, her emotional honesty, her refusal to live without affection, were precisely the qualities that doomed her, because they were the qualities her age could not tolerate in a woman of her position. The Electress survived and triumphed by being everything Sophia Dorothea was not, and Sophia Dorothea was destroyed by being everything the Electress had trained herself not to be. It would be too simple and unfair to both women to make of this a tale of a wicked mother-in-law and an innocent victim, for the Electress was not wicked, only formidably adapted to a hard age, and her contempt for her daughter-in-law was less personal malice than the impatience of the strong for the weak, of the survivor for the one who could not survive. She had paid her own price, made her own sacrifices, mastered her own heart at who knows what cost, and she very likely had little sympathy to spare for a younger woman who would not or could not do the same. To her, in all probability, Sophia Dorothea was simply a foolish girl who had failed to learn the rules, who had indulged her feelings where she should have governed them, and who had brought ruin on herself and disgrace on the family through her own want of self-command. There is even a kind of bleak logic to that view, from within the assumptions of her caste. What it leaves out, of course, is any sense that those assumptions might themselves be monstrous, that a world which demanded the murder of the heart as the price of survival might be a world worth condemning rather than mastering. The Electress never questioned the game, she only played it well. Sophia Dorothea could not play it at all and was broken, but it is she, and not her triumphant mother-in-law, whom we remember with love. Let us leave the contrast there, and return one last time to the heath, to the long quiet years that were the heart of her suffering, and try as far as we are able to enter into them, to feel from the inside what it was to be the prisoner of Ahlden through 3 decades of days. For we have spoken of her captivity in the large as a fact and a fate, but a life is not lived in the large, it is lived day by day, hour by hour, in the small particulars of waking and rising and waiting and sleeping, and it was in those particulars repeated without end across the years that the true weight of her imprisonment was born. Come with me, then, into the rooms at Ahlden, and let us imagine the texture of a single ordinary day in that long captivity, one of the thousands upon thousands she endured. She would wake, we may suppose, in a chamber comfortable enough in its furnishings, for she was never kept in squalor, to the grey light of the heath, coming through the windows and the silence of a place far from any town. There would be her women to attend her, the modest household she was allowed, faces grown familiar over years, until they were as much fixtures of her prison as the walls. There would be the slow ceremony of dressing, the careful maintenance of an appearance that no one of any consequence would see, kept up out of pride and habit, and the need to hold on to some shape of dignity. There would be the long, empty hours of the day to be filled somehow, with needlework perhaps, with reading, with prayer, with letters where letters were permitted, with the endless small occupations by which the captive holds off the void. There would be the daily drive, if the weather allowed, out along the roads of the heath under the eye of her guards, the brief taste of open air and wide horizons that was the nearest thing to freedom she was allowed, and the inevitable return, every time, to the same gates and the same walls. And there would be, threading through it all, the long thoughts of the prisoner, the memories of the warm years before, the faces of the children she could not see, the lover she had lost, the life that had been taken from her, turned over and over in the silence, until the light failed, and another day was gone, and another into the years. It is in the imagining of that, the sheer repetition of it, the same narrow round of days unrolling without change or hope across 3 decades, that we come closest to feeling what was done to her. Any single day of it might be borne easily enough. It is the endlessness that appalls, the knowledge, settling deeper with every passing year, that there would be no change, no release, no different tomorrow, only this, the same, until death. To keep one's reason and one's dignity through such a thing, to go on rising and dressing and enduring day after empty day for 32 years, is a feat of the spirit that ought to command our deep respect, and it is perhaps the truest measure of the woman, this quiet, unwitnessed heroism of simply enduring the unendurable one ordinary day at a time, until the long sentence was at last complete. And with that, our long journey through her life draws gently toward its close. It is worth asking, before we leave her, how we come to know any of this at all, how the story of a woman so deliberately erased has reached us across 3 centuries in such intimate detail, for the survival of her memory was by no means certain, and is in itself a small marvel. Her enemies, after all, had every interest in seeing the whole affair forgotten, and great power with which to enforce that forgetting. They controlled the records, suppressed the inquiries, buried the body and the truth together, and left her to die unmourned and unremembered. By every calculation of power, her story ought to have vanished, dwindling into a vague rumour of a wife shut away, the particulars lost, the truth sealed forever behind the walls of the dynasty's discretion. That it did not vanish, that we can follow the course of her love and her ruin almost step by step, is owing to a handful of fragile things that happened to survive the general burying, and the chief of these, of course, was the letters. The survival of those letters is a story in itself, a thread of pure chance running through the darkness. By rights they should have been destroyed, the most dangerous evidence of all, the very proof of the affair in the lover's own hands, and yet they came through, carried out of danger, hidden, preserved in private keeping, passed down across the generations, until at last, long after everyone concerned was dust, they could be brought into the light and read, scattered now between a library in the north and the papers of her own royal descendants. They form the irreplaceable core of everything we know of her inner life, the one place where her own voice survives, unfiltered by her enemies or her champions, speaking for herself. Without them she would be only a figure in other people's accounts, a name in the records of a scandal. With them she is a living woman whose heart we can read. That such intimate and such perilous documents should have outlived the powerful men who would have burned them is one of those quiet victories of truth over power that history occasionally affords, and we owe to it almost all the intimacy of our knowledge of her. Beyond the letters, her story survived in the way that all the secrets of that intensely social, intensely gossiping aristocratic world survived, through the memoirs and the letters and the reports of those who had watched it unfold. The courts of that age were full of observers, diplomats and visitors and members of the household, who wrote down what they saw and heard, who carried tales from court to court, who recorded in their journals and their correspondence the scandals and the dramas that passed before them. The great affair at Hanover, for all the dynasty's efforts at suppression, was simply too large and too sensational to be kept out of such records, and the accounts of those who knew the court, or knew people who knew it, preserved the outline and much of the detail of what had happened against the day when it could be freely told. From these scattered witnesses, sifted and weighed by later historians, the story was gradually reconstructed, the official silence filled in from 100 unofficial sources, until what the dynasty had tried to bury stood revealed in all its tragic clarity. There is a lesson in that survival, too, about the limits of even the greatest power to control the record and shape the memory of an age. The men who destroyed Sophia Dorothea were as powerful as any in Europe, soon to be kings, that they commanded armies and treasuries and the whole apparatus of a state, and they bent all of it to the task of erasing one inconvenient woman and her story. And they failed. They could kill her lover and imprison her person, but they could not call back every letter or silence every witness or reach into every private journal. The truth leaked out through 1,000 small channels they could not close, and survived, and grew, and triumphed in the end over all their power. It is a heartening thing to know, in a world that still, often enough, sees the powerful try to bury the facts that inconvenience them, that the burying so often fails in the long run, that the small fragile records of what really happened have a way of surviving the great machines built to suppress them. Sophia Dorothea's truth survived its burial, and that survival is itself a kind of hope. And so the woman who was meant to disappear has instead become one of the better documented tragedies of her age, her love and her ruin, and her long endurance preserved in detail enough to move us still, her own voice surviving to speak across the centuries. The dynasty got its crown and its succession. It did not get the silence it wanted. The price of its greatness, the broken woman on the heath, was recorded after all, against all its efforts, and stands in the ledger of history beside the glory, a permanent reminder of what that glory cost. We who hear her story now are the inheritors of that long, improbable survival of the truth, the latest in the line of those who have refused to let her be forgotten. And in listening to it, in giving her these few hours of our attention across the great gulf of years, we play our own small part in the justice that history has done her. It only remains now to take our leave of her, gently, as the night draws on. There is one thread of the story we have not yet followed to its end, and it is a fitting one to take up last, for it is the thread that began the whole tragedy, the matter of the inheritance, the great fortune of Celle, that had made her so desirable a bride, and drawn her into the marriage that destroyed her. It is worth following that prize to its destination, for in its journey we see the whole cold logic of the affair laid bare. Sophia Dorothea had been married against her will for one reason above all others, that she was the sole heiress of her father's rich duchy, and that whoever married her would draw all of Celle's wealth and lands into his own house. That was the prize the men of Hanover had wanted, the missing piece of the great inheritance they were so patiently assembling, and they had taken her and ruined her in the course of securing it. And secure it they did, in the end, exactly as they had schemed. When her father, the old Duke of Celle, died at last, his duchy and his fortune passed, as the whole long design had intended, into the hands of the House of Hanover, reuniting the divided patrimony of the family, and swelling still further the riches and power of the line that had imprisoned her, the very inheritance that was hers by birth, that should have been her dowry and her security, became instead simply another asset of the dynasty that had cast her off, absorbed into the growing greatness of Hanover, while she who had carried it sat captive on the heath. She had been, in the cold reckoning of it, merely the vehicle by which the inheritance passed from Celle to Hanover, the living instrument of a transfer of property, and once the property was transferred, the instrument could be discarded, which is precisely what was done with her. There is no cruel illustration in the whole story of how completely she was reduced, in the eyes of her world, from a person to a possession. And the fortune did not stop at Hanover, for Hanover itself, not long after, was joined to a crown, and so the wealth of Celle, the inheritance that had cost Sophia Dorothea her freedom and her happiness and her children, flowed onward, in the end, into the vast accumulating estate of a royal house that would rule a great kingdom across the sea. The money and the lands that had been the bait of her ruin became, in the long run, a small tributary of the river of Hanoverian and then of British royal riches, mingled indistinguishably with the rest, its origin forgotten, its terrible human cost invisible in the ledgers. No one counting that treasure in the years that followed would have thought to remember the woman whose inheritance it partly was, or the price she had paid that it might pass where it did. It was simply money now, clean and anonymous. Its history washed away. The money outlived her and forgot her, as great fortunes do, serving new masters who knew nothing of the warm and sorrowful woman whose birthright it had been. There is a bitter and a perfect irony in this, that the wealth which made her should have been the instrument of her unmaking, and should then have gone on untroubled to enrich the very house that destroyed her. Had she been poor, she would very likely have been happy. It was her fortune that doomed her, that made her a prize worth seizing and ruining, that married her into the cold house, and then, once seized, made her expendable. The thing the world most envies, great wealth, was in her case the very engine of her tragedy, and it serves as a last reminder, if any were needed, of how little the gifts of fortune have to do with the happiness of a human life. She had been given everything, and it had availed her nothing. She had been rich beyond most people's dreams and had died a prisoner, and her riches, that had brought her nothing but ruin, passed on to swell the coffers of kings who never spared her a thought. That is where the inheritance of Celle ended, and it is where the long machinery of her tragedy comes, at last, to rest. There is a further and a sadder legacy of her tragedy that is worth pausing on, for the wound that was inflicted on her family did not heal with her death, but echoed down the generations after her, in a strange and a melancholy pattern. The removal of Sophia Dorothea had torn a hole in the heart of her family, taking a mother from her children, and poisoning forever the bond between her son and his father. And that poison, once loosed, did not stay contained in a single generation. Her son, who had hated his own father in part for what had been done to his mother, grew up to be a hard and a difficult father in his turn, and came in time to hate his own son with the same bitter intensity, so that the enmity between father and heir that had begun with the imprisonment of Sophia Dorothea repeated itself, generation after generation, in the royal house she had married into. It became almost a curse upon the line, this hatred of fathers for sons, handed down like a dark inheritance, and more than one observer traced its origin back to the cold cruelty that had broken the family at its root. It is as though the violence done to her at the very founding of that royal house left a crack running through all its later history, a flaw in the foundation that worked its way upward through the generations. A family that could murder a man and imprison a woman for the sake of its honour, that could tear a mother from her children and forbid them ever to meet, had shown itself capable of a coldness that does not easily confine itself to a single act, and the children raised in the shadow of that coldness carried it forward, unable, perhaps, to give what they had never themselves received. There is a kind of grim justice in it, that the house which had sacrificed warmth and love to ambition should find itself cursed with a want of warmth and love in its own bosom for generations afterward, its fathers and sons at each other's throats, its family life a byword for discord, They had broken a warm-hearted woman to serve their cold designs, and the coldness they had chosen seemed to settle into the very blood of the line. And so Sophia Dorothea's tragedy was not only her own, but the first act of a longer drama of unhappiness that played itself out across the royal family, for decades after she was gone, a recurring estrangement of the generations that some have seen as the long shadow of her ruin. The children she was forbidden to raise grew up damaged by her absence, and their children in turn inherited the damage and passed it on. It is impossible to say how much of the later discord of that house can truly be traced to the catastrophe of 1694, and how much was simply the ordinary friction of proud and powerful men. But it is hard not to feel that something was set in motion in that terrible summer that ran on long after the principals were dead, a legacy of coldness and broken bonds that was the bitter harvest of the seed they had sown. The woman they imprisoned had wanted only to love and be loved, and the family that denied her that found itself, for generations, unable to love one another. Whether or not we call it a curse, it has the shape of one, and it is one more sorrow to lay at the door of those who ruined her. Let us hold her then, one last time, in the whole arc of her life, before we let her go into the silence of the night. She began in warmth, the adored only child of a love match, cradled in a snug and prosperous little court where she was cherished and indulged and taught to expect that the world would love her as her parents did. She grew into beauty and into a great inheritance, and that inheritance, which should have been her blessing, became the bait that drew her into the cold marriage that ruined her, handed over against her will to a husband who could not love her, and a family that despised her for the sake of money and dynasty and power. She bore her children and suffered her husband's coldness and his open infidelity, and she was lonely and humiliated and starved of affection in the midst of a glittering court, until love came to her at last in the person of a brave and doomed young count, and she reached out for it, knowing the danger, because she could not live without it. And for that, for the crime of a warm heart in a cold world, everything was taken from her in a single terrible summer. Her lover murdered, her marriage destroyed, her children torn away, her freedom ended, and the grey decades of imprisonment begun. And then she endured. That is the heart of it, in the end, her endurance, the 32 years of captivity borne without breaking, the dignity kept and the truth maintained through a lifetime, shut away on a lonely heath, while the world forgot her, and her family rose to a throne, and her children grew up strangers, and her hopes died one by one. She outlasted her father and her mother, and very nearly her husband. She outlasted her own youth and beauty and hope, and she held through all of it to the one thing they could not take from her, her own knowledge of the wrong that had been done her, her own unbroken sense of who she was. She died as she had lived through those grey decades, defiant and unconfessed, and was buried at last, unmourned by the man who had wronged her, in the town of her happy childhood, home again at the end of everything, and history, which her enemies had hoped would forget her, has instead remembered her with a tenderness it has denied them, and set her blood upon the thrones of Europe, and kept her story alive these 300 years, so that even now, tonight, in a room she could never have imagined, her life is being told, and her sorrow is being felt, and her memory is being kept. That is perhaps the gentlest thought to carry away from her long and sorrowful story, that nothing truly good is ever quite lost, that the warmth and the love and the courage that the world tried so hard to crush in her have outlived the cruelty that crushed them, and reach us still, and move us still, across all the centuries between. The cold king is dust, and the proud court is gone, and the schemers and the murderers are forgotten or remembered only with contempt. But the warm heart they broke beats on, somehow, in the telling of her tale. and the love they tried to murder is the very thing that keeps her name alive. She wanted all her life only to be loved, and she is loved now by strangers in ages she never knew, more truly perhaps than she ever was in her own cold time. There is a kind of peace in that, a quiet and a belated justice, and it is the note on which I would like to leave her, and you, as the night closes over us both. If this long quiet journey through a single sorrowful life has been the kind of company you would like to keep again on some other night when sleep is slow in coming, then you would be most welcome to stay a while, and to let these evenings find their way to you when they are ready. There is no need to do anything at all, only, if you wish it, to let it be known quietly that you would like to hear more, and more will come. I am grateful more than I can easily say, for the few hours we have spent together tonight in the company of the Queen who never was, and I hope the telling of her story has been a gentle thing to fall asleep beside, a sorrow held softly enough that it soothes rather than troubles. She has rested now for 300 years, the wronged lady of the heath, and tonight you have helped to keep her memory, and there is a kindness in that which she would, I think, have understood. So let her go now, gently, back into the long quiet of the past, and let yourself go too, down into the rest you have earned, with her story settling over you like a blanket drawn up against the cold. There is nothing more you need to do tonight, nothing more to think or to hold or to carry. The day is wholly behind you now, and the night is yours, and it asks nothing of you, but that you let it take you. Let your breathing slow, and let the last of the words wash over you and away, and let the warm dark come up to meet you as sleep, that gentlest of all releases, comes quietly to carry you off. Sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.